On my 70th birthday, I sat alone at a table for two in the most expensive steakhouse in the city. My son had canceled our dinner just hours before claiming a massive financial crisis at work. I decided to eat alone, but when the waiter led me to my table, I looked across the crowded dining room and saw my son. He was not at work. He was sitting at a VIP booth drinking vintage champagne with his wife and his mother-in-law laughing uproariously. So I did the only logical thing. I paid their $900 bill, walked up behind him, and delivered a message that froze the blood in his veins. But the real shock came when I looked at his mother-in-law's neck. That was the moment I realized they were not just ignoring me, they were robbing me blind. My name is Helen, and this is how I dismantled my son's life piece by piece. Before we continue, please leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and subscribe to the Never Too Old channel. We are creating a community of incredible people who know our best chapters happen at any age. Now back to the story. The text message arrived at exactly 4 in the afternoon. I was sitting at my vanity mirror fastening a pair of pearl earrings, feeling a quiet sense of pride about reaching my 70th year. The phone buzzed on the glass counter. I picked it up and read the words my son Thomas had typed. "Mom, I am so incredibly sorry. The market took a massive dive today and my investment firm is in total crisis mode. I am going to be stuck at the office until midnight trying to stop the bleeding. I feel terrible doing this on your milestone birthday. I will make this up to you next week. Happy 70th. Love you." I read the message 3 times. Thomas was 45 years old, a senior portfolio manager at a prestigious downtown firm. Financial emergencies happened. I understood the demanding nature of corporate life better than most people. I had spent enough years in demanding professional environments to understand that markets could turn an ordinary afternoon into a crisis without warning. I knew what real financial panic looked like. I replied simply, "Do not worry about me, Thomas. Focus on your work. We will celebrate later." I put the phone down, but the house suddenly felt entirely too large and far too quiet. My husband Arthur had passed away 4 years ago. Thomas was my only child. Valerie, his wife, had sent a generic text message that morning with a digital balloon emoji, and my grandson Caleb, who was 19 and away at his 2nd year of college, had called me briefly between his classes. I was completely alone on my 70th birthday. I looked at my reflection. I was already dressed in a tailored navy blazer and a silk blouse. I had made a reservation at the Oak Room, the most exclusive steakhouse in our city, weeks in advance. I decided I was not going to spend my milestone birthday eating a cold sandwich in my kitchen. I picked up my purse, grabbed my keys, and drove myself to the restaurant. The Oak Room was exactly as elegant as I remembered. Dark mahogany wood paneled the walls, thick velvet curtains muffled the sounds of the street outside, and the soft clinking of crystal glasses filled the air. The maitre d' greeted me warmly, though his eyes flickered with a brief moment of professional pity when I told him my guest would not be arriving. He led me to a quiet corner booth, discreetly removing the second-place setting. I ordered a dry martini and a ribeye steak, determined to enjoy my own company. I took a sip of the icy martini and let my eyes wander across the dining room. It was a bustling Friday evening. Wealthy couples celebrating anniversaries, business partners, sealing deals over expensive scotch. And then my gaze stopped. My breath caught in my throat. My hands went completely still on the white tablecloth. 3 tables away, seated in a plush semi-private booth near the wine cellar, was my son Thomas. I was not wearing his office attire. He was wearing a casual linen sports coat. Sitting next to him was his wife Valerie, wearing a bright cocktail dress. And sitting across from them was Patricia, Valerie's mother. Patricia was a woman who practically sweated pretension, always boasting about her country club memberships and her high society connections. I sat frozen in my corner, completely obscured by a large decorative palm plant. I watched them. Thomas threw his head back, laughing loudly at something Patricia said. The waiter approached their table carrying a silver ice bucket. I recognized the distinct green shield on the bottle immediately. Dom Perignon. It was a $300 bottle of champagne. The waiter popped the cork and poured the sparkling liquid into their glasses. Thomas raised his glass, clinking it against Valerie's and Patricia's in a cheerful toast. My heart did not break. I did not feel the sudden urge to cry. Age had taught me not to confuse emotion with a useful response. When something felt wrong, I became quiet, observed carefully, and let facts speak first. Instead of sorrow, a cold, calculating clarity washed over me. My son had lied to my face on my 70th birthday so he could take his wife and his mother-in-law out for a lavish dinner. I watched them order extravagant appetizers, thick cuts of prime beef, and a second bottle of wine. I ate my dinner in silence, chewing methodically, calculating the situation. Why lie? If he had simply said he had plans with his mother-in-law, it would have been insulting, but lying about a financial crisis to avoid his own mother's milestone birthday was a different level of betrayal. It was cowardice. When I finished my meal, I wiped my mouth with the linen napkin. I signaled for my waiter. When he arrived, I did not ask for my check. Instead, I pointed discreetly across the room toward Thomas's table. "I would like to pay for table 12, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. The waiter looked surprised. "Are you certain, ma'am? Their bill is quite substantial." I opened my leather clutch and pulled out my heavy black American Express corporate card. I maintained premium accounts simply out of habit from my working days. "Yes, I am certain. Please add a 20% gratuity for yourself and bring me the receipt to sign at the host stand. Do not tell them the bill is settled until I have left the building." The waiter nodded, taking the card. I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my navy blazer, and walked calmly to the front of the restaurant. I signed the merchant copy of the receipt. The total was $940. I took my card back, slipped it into my purse, and turned around. I walked directly across the center of the dining room. I did not rush. I kept my posture perfect, my chin high, my steps measured. As I approached their booth, Valerie was the first to see me. She had a fork full of crab cake halfway to her mouth. Her jaw went slack. The fork lowered slowly back to her plate. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly pale under the restaurant's warm lighting. Thomas noticed her expression and turned his head around. His eyes locked onto mine. His mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. The arrogant, laughing man from 30 seconds ago completely vanished, replaced by a terrified boy caught in a lie. I did not stop walking. I did not cause a scene. I simply paused as I passed directly behind Thomas's chair. I leaned down, placing one hand lightly on his shoulder. He flinched under my touch as if I had burned him. I put my mouth near his ear and whispered, keeping my tone sweet and pleasant. "I was happy to cover your massive work crisis, sweetheart. Enjoy the champagne." I stood back up. I did not look at Valerie. I did not look at Patricia. I simply continued walking forward, pushing through the heavy wooden doors of the restaurant and stepping out into the cool evening air. I handed my ticket to the valet, tipped him generously, and waited for my car. My heart was beating a steady, rhythmic drum in my chest. I felt a strange sense of power. I had handled it perfectly. But as I stood there under the streetlights, a delayed image flashed across my mind. It was a visual detail my brain had recorded in the restaurant, but had not fully processed until this exact moment. When I had looked down at the table, I had seen Patricia. She was wearing a low-cut blouse, and resting against her collarbone was a necklace. It was not just any necklace. It was a vintage platinum chain featuring a massive teardrop sapphire flanked by two flawless, brilliant-cut diamonds. It was a custom, one-of-a-kind piece. I knew it was one of a kind because my late husband, Arthur, had commissioned it from a private jeweler in Paris for our 40th wedding anniversary. The valet pulled my car up to the curb. I got in, gripped the leather steering wheel, and stared blankly at the dashboard. That necklace belonged to me. It was not in my jewelry box. I did not keep pieces of that value lying around the house. That sapphire necklace was supposed to be locked inside the biometric steel wall safe, hidden behind a landscape painting in my home study. The cold clarity that had carried me out of the restaurant suddenly shattered, replaced by a sharp, ringing alarm. Patricia was wearing my stolen property. How did she get it, Thomas? Thomas was the only other person in the world who knew the digital bypass code to that safe. I had given it to him 4 years ago, when Arthur was dying in the hospital, just in case something happened to me, and Thomas needed to access our emergency documents. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. I drove through the affluent suburban streets faster than the speed limit allowed. The streetlights blurred past my windows. My mind was racing, running through variables and calculations like a machine. If Thomas had opened the safe to take the necklace for his mother-in-law, what else had he taken? I pulled into my driveway, ignoring the garage, entirely leaving the car, parked haphazardly on the concrete. I unlocked the front door, deactivated the security alarm, and walked straight down the hallway to Arthur's old study. The room smelled faintly of old paper and the cedar wood panels lining the walls. I walked directly to the large oil painting of a coastal lighthouse hanging behind the desk. I pulled the painting outward on its hidden hinges. The dark gray face of the wall safe stared back at me. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The light blinked green. I turned the heavy steel handle and the thick door swung open with a quiet hiss. I reached inside. The interior was divided into 3 steel shelves. I pulled out the black velvet jewelry box from the bottom shelf. I snapped the lid open. It was completely empty. The molded velvet insert where the sapphire necklace usually rested was bare. My breathing grew shallow. I looked at the middle shelf. I kept a heavy fireproof document envelope there. It contained the original property deed to the summer cabin Arthur and I had bought on Lake Tahoe decades ago. The cabin was fully paid off, worth roughly $600,000 in the current market. I reached into the safe. My hand met empty air. The envelope was gone. Panic, hot and sharp, flared in my chest. I dropped to my knees to look at the top shelf. This was where I kept my most secure financial assets. As a former tax auditor, I knew the value of untraceable liquidity in the event of an extreme emergency. I had kept a stack of municipal bearer bonds in a sealed plastic sleeve. Bearer bonds are essentially cash. Whoever physically holds the paper owns the money. There is no registry, no name attached. I had exactly $200,000 worth of bonds sitting on that top shelf. I reached up. The shelf was entirely bare. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight. $200,000 in untraceable bonds. A property deed worth over $500,000. A priceless family heirloom. All of it was gone, stripped clean. My son had not just skipped my birthday dinner to drink champagne. He had systematically raided my most secure assets. My own flesh and blood had robbed me. I sat back on my heels on the carpet, the reality of the betrayal pressing down on me so heavily I felt like I was suffocating. I had spent a lifetime believing facts would expose deception, and now the person deceiving me had been sitting at my own Thanksgiving table. Before I could process my next move, a sudden violent sound shattered the silence of the house. Someone was pounding frantically on my back door. I jumped, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. I closed the safe, quickly pushed the painting back into place, and hurried toward the kitchen. The pounding continued, loud and desperate, rattling the glass panes of the door. I grabbed a heavy iron fireplace poker from the living room on my way past, gripping it tightly. I approached the kitchen door and peered through the edge of the curtain. Standing on my back porch under the yellow security light was my grandson, Caleb. I was 19, wearing a faded college sweatshirt and carrying a heavy, bulging manila folder pressed tightly against his chest. He looked completely terrified. He was looking over his shoulder toward the street, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I quickly unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Caleb practically fell inside, pushing past me into the kitchen. He spun around and locked the door himself, his breathing ragged and uneven. "Caleb, what is going on?" I asked, lowering the iron poker. "Why are you banging on my door at 9 o'clock at night?" He turned to look at me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He held the thick manila folder out toward me with shaking hands. "Grandma, you have to look at this," he said, his voice cracking with panic. "I drove straight here from campus. You have to let me explain before Dad realizes what I took from his home office." I looked at the folder, then back at my grandson's terrified face. "What did you take, Caleb?" "They think you are going senile, Grandma." He whispered, the words tumbling out of him in a rush. "Dad and Mom and Uncle Greg, they are building a case against you. You have to look at what Dad is printing out. They are planning to take everything." Caleb stood in my kitchen, panting and dripping with nervous sweat. He threw a heavy manila folder onto my granite island. I did not ask him if he wanted water or treat him like a frightened child. I simply opened the folder. The top page was an email printout. The subject line read, "Helen Cognitive Decline Timeline." The sender was Valerie. The recipients were my son Thomas and Valerie brother Greg. Greg was a slick and fast-talking real estate attorney who wore suits that cost more than a reliable used vehicle. I read the first paragraph, and the cold clarity that had settled over me in the steakhouse turned into absolute ice. For the last 6 months, I had been waking up to minor nightmares. My electric bill would vanish from the mail sorting tray. The coffee maker would be inexplicably unplugged. My spare set of car keys turned up inside the crisper drawer of the refrigerator. The most terrifying incident occurred 3 weeks prior when I found a stove burner clicking ominously without a flame. Thomas had rushed over acting frantic and telling me I was a danger to myself. I had spent nights crying quietly in my bathroom. I was terrified that the sharp and analytical mind I had relied on my entire life was finally betraying me. I truly believed I was experiencing the early stages of dementia. The fear of losing my independence was a suffocating weight on my chest. But I was not losing my mind. Valerie had been actively staging my descent into senility. The printed emails detailed every cruel trick. Valerie casually mentioned how she slipped into my house using the spare key to move my belongings while I was gardening in the backyard. She laughed about hiding my reading glasses in the microwave. Thomas replied with praise and instructed her to document every confused phone call I made to him. They were deliberately manufacturing a medical crisis. I looked up at Caleb. His eyes were wide and filled with tears. I explained that he had been trying to use his father home office printer for a college assignment when he found the email thread left open on the desktop monitor. He dug deeper into the hard drive and found out exactly why they were doing it. My son Thomas had not just canceled my birthday dinner because of a sudden work crisis. He had no work to go to. Thomas had been fired from his investment firm 3 months ago for making unauthorized and highly leveraged trades that cost his clients a fortune. He was drowning in insurmountable debt. Greg was in equally deep waters. The slick lawyer brother-in-law had promised his daughter a lavish $150,000 wedding at the most exclusive country club in the county, but his law practice was bleeding cash. Add in Patricia, who demanded constant luxury and expensive vacations, and the picture was complete. They were entirely broke. I possessed a liquid estate worth over $6 million. I had carefully managed and grown this wealth over decades of hard work. The email thread proved they were drafting a petition for a legal conservatorship. They wanted to declare me incompetent and lock me away in a care facility. They planned to take total control of my assets to fund their pathetic and desperate lives. They saw me as nothing more than a walking bank account that they needed to crack open. I did not scream. I did not break down in tears. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out my reading glasses. Then I reached into the pen cup and pulled out a fine-tip red pen. For 30 years before I retired, I was a senior certified public accountant. I conducted complex forensic audits for the Internal Revenue Service. I spent my entire career dismantling the elaborate lies of corporate fraudsters and tax evaders. My family had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed I was just a wealthy and aging widow waiting to fade away. They forgot that I made a living finding the truth hidden deep within the numbers. I flipped to the next section of the manila folder. Greg had drafted financial exhibits to present to a judge. He intended to prove I was grossly mismanaging my own money. They had printed out my recent bank statements, or rather what they claimed were my bank statements. I put my glasses on and leaned over the paper. The red pen in my hand felt like a weapon I had not wielded in years. I spotted the first critical error in exactly 3 seconds. Greg had altered the balance columns using standard editing software, but he had failed to align the decimal points correctly. In professional banking ledgers, the kerning of the numbers is absolute. His decimal points were off by a fraction of a millimeter. I dragged my red pen across the fake numbers. Then I examined the calculated interest yields on the fraudulent balance. The math did not match. The compounded interest formula Greg utilized was inherently flawed. Furthermore, I looked at the routing number at the bottom of the page. It was the correct bank, but it was an old routing format that my institution had phased out 2 years ago. Greg had used an outdated statement template and simply changed the dates. It was incredibly sloppy work. I circled the routing number and drew a sharp line through the entire page. They were going to submit forged financial documents to a state judge to steal my life. My son was not just a liar. I was a federal criminal. I looked at Caleb, who was watching me with a mixture of awe and terror. He had risked everything to bring this evidence to me. If Thomas found out his own son had betrayed him, Caleb would be cut off entirely. I told Caleb that he had done a very brave thing. I told him I was going to protect him, but he needed to listen to me very carefully. Before I could formulate my next tactical move, Caleb raised his hand. He pointed a trembling finger toward the ceiling. He leaned in close and whispered so softly I could barely hear him. He told me to keep my voice down. He said Thomas had installed cameras in my house a month ago. Thomas had told me it was a top-of-the-line security system upgrade to keep me safe since I lived alone. He had even hired a professional-looking crew to install motion sensors and smart thermostats. What Caleb had discovered on his father's computer was the live feed. The system included hidden audio and video recorders tucked inside the smoke detectors and the living room bookshelf. They were not protecting me. They were surveilling me. They were waiting for me to have another manufactured memory lapse so they could record it and play it for a judge in a courtroom. The instinct to grab my heavy brass bookend and smash every smoke detector in the house surged through my veins. The profound violation of my privacy made my stomach turn, but my years at the IRS had taught me immense patience. When you find a wiretap, you do not destroy it. You use it to feed the enemy exactly what you want them to hear. I grabbed a yellow legal pad from my desk. I wrote a question in thick black marker and slid it across the island to Caleb. "Where are the blind spots?" Caleb took the marker. His hand was shaking as he wrote his reply. "The pantry, the hallway bathroom, the far corner of your study behind the tall filing cabinet." I nodded. I tore the paper off the pad and slipped it into my pocket. I took a deep breath and smoothed my expression into one of pleasant and focused calm. I walked out of the kitchen and stepped directly into the center of the living room, right in the primary field of view of the bookshelf camera. I did not look at the lens. I walked over to my desk and picked up my landline phone. I dialed my wealth management broker. I spoke loudly and clearly, ensuring the hidden microphones picked up every single syllable of my conversation. I asked my broker to review the performance of my municipal bond portfolio over the last quarter. I casually discussed complex tax harvesting strategies for the upcoming fiscal year. I cited specific tax codes and demonstrated a razor-sharp understanding of current market volatility. I asked pointed questions about the yield curve and maturity dates. I thanked him and hung up the phone. Then I walked to the kitchen and began to bake a complex pastry, measuring every single ingredient with absolute and undeniable precision. I narrated my actions aloud, as if I were talking to my late husband, proving my short-term and long-term memory were perfectly intact. I was projecting the undeniable image of a highly competent and financially astute woman who was in total control of her faculties. I was systematically creating a video record of my absolute sanity. This footage would completely contradict whatever edited narrative Thomas and Greg were trying to build for their fake court case. I moved smoothly into the kitchen pantry, standing perfectly still in the narrow blind spot between the canned goods and the shelving units. Caleb slipped in quietly beside me, closing the door just enough to shield us from view. The claustrophobia of hiding inside my own home was infuriating but necessary. I handed him the notepad. I wrote that he needed to go back home and act exactly as he normally would. He was not to confront his father or his mother under any circumstances. I was my inside man now, and his safety depended on his ability to play along. Caleb nodded, writing down that he understood the assignment. He pulled out his phone to check the time, but his face went completely pale in the dim light of the pantry. He stared at the screen, scrolling rapidly through his notifications. He shoved the phone toward me. It was a group text message notification he had intercepted through his synced family cloud account. The message was from Thomas to Greg. The text read that the notary is confirmed for tomorrow morning at 9. It instructed Greg to have the surrender forms ready. It told Valerie to be prepared to act incredibly sympathetic when she helps Helen sign the tax returns. My blood ran cold. They were not waiting for the natural progression of their psychological gaslighting campaign anymore. They were moving in for the kill immediately. They were coming to my house tomorrow morning under the guise of helping me sign my annual tax returns. But I knew exactly what was hiding in that heavy stack of paper. They were bringing the conservatorship surrender forms. They were hoping my poor eyesight and my misplaced trust in my only son would lead me to sign away my freedom and my fortune with a single stroke of a pen. I took the marker and wrote one final sentence on the notepad for Caleb to read. "They are bringing the surrender forms." I looked my grandson in the eyes and offered him a cold and calculated smile. "Let them come." The heavy brass knocker on my front door sounded exactly at 9 o'clock the next morning. The strikes were loud, rapid, and carried an undeniable sense of arrogant authority. I was sitting at my kitchen island sipping a cup of Earl Grey tea. I took one final calming breath, adjusting the delicate gold chain of my reading glasses so it rested perfectly against my collarbone. I let my shoulders slump forward just a fraction, softening my spine to project the image of a frail and deeply confused elderly woman. I shuffled my feet slightly as I walked down the hallway to answer the door. Thomas stood on my front porch, wearing a crisp charcoal suit, projecting the absolute image of a successful and caring son. Standing right beside him was Valerie's brother Greg. Greg was a real estate attorney who possessed the kind of aggressive, overly polished charm that always made my skin crawl. He wore a heavy gold watch that he constantly adjusted, and his smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. Trailing behind the two men was a woman I had never seen before. She was aggressively chewing a piece of peppermint gum, carrying a cheap vinyl briefcase, and reeked of generic floral perfume. "Good morning, Mom," Thomas said, using a voice that was sickeningly sweet and loud, the exact tone one might use to speak to a very slow toddler. "We brought Greg over to help with that complicated tax paperwork we discussed last night. And this is Brenda. She is a certified notary public. She is just here to make everything official, so you do not have to worry your pretty head about the IRS anymore." I opened the door wider, letting my hands tremble visibly as I gripped the brass handle. "Oh, Thomas," I said, making my voice waver with manufactured anxiety. "I am so glad you are here. I was trying to read the morning newspaper, but the words just kept jumping around on the page. My memory has been so foggy lately. I just feel entirely overwhelmed by all these forms." Greg stepped right past me without waiting for an invitation. He marched directly into my dining room and dropped a remarkably thick stack of legal documents onto my mahogany table. "That is exactly why we are here," Helen Gregg said, flashing his predatory smile. "We are family. We are here to lift this heavy burden right off your shoulders. You have worked hard your whole life. It is time for you to just rest and let us take the wheel." I shuffled into the dining room and took a seat at the head of the table. Brenda the notary dropped her vinyl briefcase onto the floor and pulled out an ink stamp, looking entirely bored with the entire proceeding. She did not ask for my identification. She did not ask me standard notary verification questions to ensure I was of sound mind. She simply stood there cracking her chewing gum. She was clearly a hired prop. A friend of Greg brought in to rubber stamp a fraudulent legal transaction without asking any inconvenient questions. Greg slid the massive stack of papers directly in front of me. He completely bypassed the first 40 pages, flipping the stack straight to the back, where a single line of blank space waited for my signature. The document was dense with complex legal jargon formatted with narrow margins and tiny font. But my eyes were sharp. In a fraction of a second, my peripheral vision caught the bold header on the third page. It did not say Internal Revenue Service. It did not say Annual Tax Declaration. The header read, "Durable General Power of Attorney and Voluntary Surrender of Conservatorship." If I signed my name on that final line, I would legally declare myself mentally incompetent. I would instantly grant Thomas total unfettered access to my $6 million estate. He could sell my house, liquidate my municipal bonds, and lock me in a heavily medicated memory care ward before the sun went down. "Here we go," Helen Gregg said, tapping his manicured index finger aggressively against the signature line. "Just press hard right here. We will take these straight to the county clerk and get the IRS off your back for good." I reached out with a trembling hand and let my fingers graze the edge of the paper. Then I pulled my hand back sharply and let out a soft, distressed gasp. I brought my hand up to my forehead, squeezing my eyes shut, as if I were fighting off a sudden wave of severe dizziness. "Thomas," I whispered, my voice incredibly frail and breathless. "Thomas, my chest feels so tight. My mouth is completely dry. I cannot focus on these letters. Could you please be a dear and get your mother a tall glass of ice water from the kitchen? I feel like I might faint." Thomas rolled his eyes, letting out a sharp sigh of profound annoyance. He clearly hated playing the role of the devoted son, even when a massive fortune was on the line. "Hang on, Mom," he muttered dismissively. "I will get your water. Just sit still." Thomas turned his back and marched into the kitchen. The second he left the room, Greg pulled his mobile phone from his suit pocket to check a sudden incoming text message. Brenda was busy staring out the front window, entirely disengaged. I had a window of exactly 5 seconds. The trembling, frail woman completely vanished. My hands moved with lightning speed and absolute precision. I slid my hand under the thick stack of papers and pulled the authentic conservatorship signature page cleanly from the bottom. I dropped it silently into my lap. In the same motion, I reached into the hidden pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a heavy stock page I had prepared before dawn. It was an acknowledgement page tied to a revocation of limited proxy, but I had matched the margins, paperweight footer and signature line to Greg's packet. To anyone glancing quickly, it looked like the final page of his conservatorship stack. In reality, it surrendered nothing. I slid my replacement page seamlessly under Greg's papers. Thomas walked back into the dining room and slammed a glass of ice water onto the mahogany table. Water splashed over the rim, soaking into the wooden surface. "Drink it and sign," Mom Thomas said, completely abandoning his sweet tone. "I have places to be this morning." I took a slow, trembling sip of the water. Then I reached into the front pocket of my blazer and pulled out my own pen. It was a sleek, silver ballpoint pen. It looked like any expensive writing instrument you might buy at a luxury stationery store, but it was not a standard pen. During my 30 years as a forensic tax auditor, I encountered every trick in the financial underworld. I tracked down criminals who used vanishing inks, acid washes, and digital manipulation. Because of this, I always carried a very specific tool. The pen in my hand was loaded with advanced thermal friction ink. It was a chemical compound designed for drafting temporary architectural blueprints. The ink flows onto the paper as a rich, dark black line. It looks completely permanent. But the moment that ink is exposed to a temperature exceeding 140 degrees Fahrenheit, the chemical bonds break down. The ink turns completely transparent. It literally vanishes into thin air. I uncapped the thermal friction pen. I leaned over Greg's fraudulent document. I pressed the tip to the fake signature page I had inserted. I wrote my name, Helen Claire Montgomery, in large flowing cursive letters. The black ink settled deeply into the paper. It looked beautiful. It looked binding. It was entirely temporary. "Excellent," Greg said, snatching the stack of papers off the table the second my pen lifted from the page. He did not even bother to say goodbye. He handed the stack to Brenda, who quickly stamped her notary seal over my vanishing signature. Thomas leaned down and gave me a stiff, completely loveless pat on the shoulder. "Rest up, Mom," Thomas said, a dark, victorious smirk spreading across his face. "Do not worry about a single thing. I am going to take care of all your finances from now on. You are in good hands." They walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind them. I sat alone in the dining room, listening to the heavy engine of Greg's luxury sedan roar to life in my driveway. I picked up my teacup. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of Earl Grey. I looked at the digital thermometer on my wall. It was the middle of July. The ambient outdoor temperature was already pushing 90 degrees. Greg was a man who loved his suits, which meant he would throw that manila folder directly onto the dashboard or the back seat of his car while he drove. The interior of a dark, luxury sedan parked in the summer sun reaches 150 degrees in exactly 20 minutes. By the time Greg carried those documents into the county courthouse, he would be holding a stack of papers with a completely blank signature line. They had absolutely nothing. The moment their car turned the corner at the end of my street, the door to my hallway bathroom clicked open. Caleb stepped out. He was holding his laptop, his chest rising and falling with heavy, anxious breaths. He walked into the dining room and stared at the empty space on the table. Grandma, Caleb asked, his voice shaking with nervous energy. "Did you just sign away your entire estate? Did they win?" I smiled. I reached into my lap and pulled out the authentic signature page for the conservatorship document. I ripped it cleanly in half and tossed it into the nearest wastebasket. "They did not win anything, Caleb," I said, my voice sharp and commanding. "Now open your laptop and log into my secure banking portal. We have exactly 30 minutes before your father makes his fatal move." Caleb placed his laptop on the mahogany table and quickly typed in the credentials I provided. As the screen loaded, I explained the second phase of my trap. 4 years ago, when Arthur was in his final days at the hospital, the medical bills were overwhelming. I was spending 24 hours a day sitting by his bedside. To ensure our household expenses and immediate medical costs were covered, I had granted Thomas a limited financial proxy. It was a very specific, narrowly tailored power of attorney that allowed him to move funds from a secondary checking account. I never revoked it because at the time, I still believed my son was a decent human being. Thomas knew the conservatorship papers he just stole from my table would take at least 3 business days to process through the chaotic county court system. But Thomas was broke, desperate, and heavily in debt. He needed cash immediately. I knew with absolute certainty that he would not wait for the court. He was going to use his existing outdated limited proxy to wire money today, assuming I was too senile to notice the missing funds. But Thomas did not know what I had done at 6 o'clock this morning. While Thomas was sleeping, I had logged into my banking portal and filed the revocation of proxy referenced by the page hidden in Greg's stack. It stripped Thomas of every remaining financial authorization connected to my name. The bank had time-stamped and verified it before sunrise. My thermal signature was theater. The revocation was already effective. Caleb stared at the banking dashboard on his laptop screen. The interface showed my primary accounts, my investment yields, and a real-time transaction monitoring log. The digital clock in the corner of the screen ticked forward. We sat in silence watching the monitor. Grandma Caleb set his eyes glued to the screen. "Why are we watching this? What exactly is going to happen?" "If my calculations are correct," I said, leaning over his shoulder, "your father is currently walking into the main branch of our bank downtown. He's going to walk up to a teller and present his old limited proxy paperwork. He is going to attempt to wire a massive sum of money directly into Greg's law firm account. He needs to pay for Patricia's lifestyle, clear his own massive debts, and fund your cousin's ridiculous country club wedding." The laptop screen suddenly flashed. A bright yellow banner appeared across the top of the transaction log. A pending outgoing wire transfer had just been initiated. "Look at the amount," I commanded. Caleb gasped. The pending transfer was for exactly $500,000. The recipient account belonged to Greg's corporate law firm. Thomas was trying to steal $500,000 in broad daylight. The yellow banner on the screen pulsed for exactly 4 seconds. Then the color shifted violently from yellow to a blaring, brilliant red. The word pending was instantly replaced by the word denied. "It worked," I whispered, a profound wave of satisfaction washing over me. Federal banking software is incredibly rigid. When an individual attempts to execute a high-value wire transfer using a power of attorney that has been officially revoked by the primary account holder, the system does not just decline the transaction. The software algorithm automatically categorizes the attempt as a severe instance of unauthorized wire fraud. We watched the screen as the red banner expanded. A new notification popped up. It read, "Automated Federal Fraud Freeze Initiated." Thomas attempting to steal my money using a dead proxy had triggered a catastrophic security protocol. The bank did not just freeze the $500,000. To protect the potential victim, the banking system automatically reached out and froze the accounts of the perpetrator. Every single bank account tied to Thomas's Social Security number was instantly locked down. His checking account, his savings account, his credit cards, and his remaining investment portfolios were frozen solid. He could not buy a cup of coffee. He could not put gas in his car. He was financially paralyzed. The silence in my dining room was broken by the sharp, aggressive ringing of my mobile phone. Caleb jumped. He looked at the caller identification flashing on the screen. It was Thomas. I let it ring 3 times. I took another slow sip of my tea. Then I pressed the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. "Mom," Thomas said. His voice was pitched high-tight and vibrating with an absolutely frantic energy. He was trying desperately to sound sweet, but the underlying panic was completely undeniable. "Mom, hey, how are you feeling? Listen, I am at the bank right now trying to sort out some of your tax payments, and the teller is saying there is a tiny microscopic glitch with our proxy paperwork. Did you accidentally call the bank this morning and confuse the customer service representative?" I smiled at my grandson. I kept my voice perfectly calm, entirely lucid, and dripping with razor-sharp clarity. "There is no glitch, Thomas," I said. My voice did not shake. The fragile old woman was gone. I revoked your proxy at 6 in the morning, and attempting to wire $500,000 of my money to your brother-in-law using voided legal documents is a federal crime. I hope you enjoy the fraud freeze on your accounts. I did not wait for his response. I ended the call, turned off my phone, and looked at Caleb. "Get your coat," I said. "We have a wedding to dismantle." The invitation arrived via text message early Sunday morning. Valerie wanted to host a family lunch at their home. She claimed it was a gesture of reconciliation, a chance to clear the air after the confusion of the past few days. I knew better. I wore a tailored beige suit, slipped my phone into my blazer pocket with the voice recording application already running, and drove to their sprawling colonial home in the affluent suburbs. The driveway was packed. Greg's silver luxury sedan was parked right behind Thomas's massive sport utility vehicle. When Valerie opened the front door, she wore a tight, strained smile. There was no scent of roasting chicken or baking bread drifting from the kitchen. The house smelled entirely of expensive air freshener and cold manufactured anxiety. She led me into the sunken living room without offering to take my coat. They were waiting for me. Thomas, Greg, and Patricia sat in a deliberate stage circle of plush armchairs. An empty, high-backed leather chair sat in the center of the arrangement, clearly waiting for me. It was not a Sunday lunch. It was a calculated ambush. I took my seat calmly. I crossed my legs and let my hands rest gracefully in my lap. Thomas leaned forward, clasping his hands together in a theatrical display of profound manufactured grief. "Mom," he began, his voice dripping with rehearsed sorrow. "We are all here because we love you. We truly do. But we need to have a very serious talk about your cognitive decline. Things are getting completely out of control. You accidentally froze your own banking portfolio on Friday. You are becoming a massive danger to your own financial well-being." I did not shout. I did not act defensive. I looked directly across the coffee table at Patricia. She was sitting next to Valerie, looking incredibly smug and self-important. Resting against her collarbone, catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the bay window, was my vintage sapphire necklace. The sheer audacity of the woman was breathtaking. She was wearing my stolen property right to my face, believing I was too far gone to even recognize it. I smiled politely. "That is a stunning piece of jewelry, Patricia," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "Wherever did you find it?" Patricia touched the magnificent sapphire with a perfectly manicured finger. "Oh, this old thing," she said, offering a condescending and breezy laugh. "I picked it up at a lovely little estate sale across town yesterday. The previous owner clearly had absolutely no idea of its true market value. I just had to rescue it." I let the blatant lie hang in the heavy air of the living room. I turned my attention back to Thomas. "You mentioned my accounts were frozen," I said, keeping my tone mild and genuinely curious. "I am so terribly confused, Thomas. How exactly did you find out my accounts were locked down? I never called you to tell you that." Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Greg immediately jumped in to rescue him, smoothing his expensive silk tie with an arrogant flourish. "Helen, this is exactly what we mean," Greg said, using his commanding courtroom voice. "You are completely losing your grip on reality. Thomas was simply trying to protect your assets. He was attempting to move a portion of your funds into a secure family-managed trust account at my law firm to keep it safe from financial predators. When he tried to initiate the transfer, the bank informed us of the freeze. You triggered a lockdown without even realizing it." I leaned forward, looking my son squarely in the eyes. I needed to hear the exact words captured perfectly on the recording device hidden in my pocket. "So, Thomas," I asked gently, "you admit that you attempted to transfer $500,000 of my money into Greg's corporate law firm account without my direct verbal authorization?" Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair like a weary and burdened martyr. "Yes, Mom. I tried to move the $500,000. I was trying to save you from yourself. You cannot manage that kind of wealth anymore. You need round-the-clock professional care. Valerie and I have selected a wonderful assisted living facility for you. Greg has the permanent conservatorship paperwork ready to file with the judge tomorrow morning. We can make this completely painless, or we can call Adult Protective Services today and have you forcibly evaluated by the state." I had exactly what I needed. I possessed a clear, legally recorded confession of attempted unauthorized wire fraud, justified by a completely fabricated medical diagnosis. I stood up, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my beige trousers. I looked around the circle of desperate, greedy faces. "I think I will pass on the assisted living facility," I said pleasantly. "And Patricia, do be careful with that necklace. The platinum clasp is somewhat delicate. I would hate for you to lose it before its rightful owner reclaims it." I walked out of their house, leaving them sitting in a stunned and deeply uncomfortable silence. I got into my car and drove straight to a quiet municipal park on the edge of town. Caleb was waiting for me at a wooden picnic table shielded by the shade of a large oak tree. His laptop was open and connected to a mobile hotspot. We had secured the criminal confession, but we still lacked the fundamental motive. Why was Greg, a supposedly successful real estate attorney, so incredibly desperate to help Thomas steal my money right now? Why was their timeline so aggressive? I sat down next to my grandson on the wooden bench. "Open the state business registry database," I instructed. "Pull up every single limited liability company registered to Greg's home address and his corporate law firm. Let us see exactly what kind of ghost ships your uncle is sailing." Caleb's fingers flew across the keyboard. As a 19-year-old digital native, he navigated the complex public records portals with astonishing speed. I directed him to cross-reference Greg's corporate filings with the local county property tax records. For 2 intense hours, we sat in the park, downloading property deeds, tax assessments, and public financial disclosure forms. My decades of forensic accounting experience guided us directly through the labyrinth of corporate shell games. Greg had created a dozen dummy corporations, transferring money back and forth between them to create the false illusion of massive capital gains. But the real devastating breakthrough came when Caleb located a publicly accessible but highly obscure investment newsletter published by their wealthy suburban church. Thomas and Valerie attended a massive affluent congregation filled with upper-middle-class professionals. Greg was the respected chairman of the church finance committee. I stared at the laptop screen as the hidden truth finally clicked into place. The realization made my blood run entirely cold. This was not just a case of an unemployed son trying to maintain a country club lifestyle. This was a massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. Greg and Thomas had been using their trusted leadership positions within the church to solicit private, unregistered investments from the elderly congregation members. They promised aggressively high returns on commercial real estate developments that simply did not exist. They had systematically drained the church youth ministry fund, the building expansion fund, and the private retirement accounts of dozens of innocent, faithful people. They had lost all of that stolen capital in a series of disastrous, highly leveraged stock market bets that went entirely wrong when the market dipped. "Look at this date right here," Caleb said, pointing a shaking finger to a digital church bulletin on the screen. "The annual independent audit for the church financial board is scheduled for next Tuesday." The aggressive timeline suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. Greg and Thomas were completely out of time. When the independent auditors arrived next Tuesday, the missing church funds would be immediately exposed. The paper trail would lead directly back to them. They would face decades in federal prison for racketeering and embezzlement. They desperately needed to liquidate my $6 million estate to silently refund the church accounts and cover up their massive theft before the auditors discovered the empty vaults. Furthermore, Greg was currently using the last remnants of the stolen church money to pay for his daughter's extravagant $150,000 wedding, which was scheduled for this coming Saturday. If I took my recorded audio confession to the local police right now, the authorities would immediately freeze all of Greg and Thomas's assets as part of a lengthy criminal investigation. The funds would be tied up in complex federal litigation for years. The innocent church elders would lose their entire life savings, and the youth ministry would be completely bankrupted. I could not let innocent people become collateral damage in my son's desperate, pathetic cover-up. I looked at Caleb. The Saturday wedding reception was being held at the absolute most exclusive country club venue in the city. Every single wealthy church elder, every duped investor, and every member of the finance committee would be sitting in that ballroom drinking expensive champagne and celebrating Greg's supposedly successful family. "We cannot go to the police today," I told my grandson, closing the laptop screen. "If the government seizes the accounts right now, the church members will never see their hard-earned retirement money again. We have to force Greg and Thomas to liquidate their hidden emergency assets and restitute the victims immediately. And the only way to effectively do that is to dismantle their entire empire in front of their investors." Caleb swallowed hard, looking at me with a mixture of fear and deep, unwavering respect. "How are we going to do that, Grandma?" I smiled, feeling the familiar thrilling rush of a meticulously planned audit taking shape in my mind. "We are going to attend a beautiful wedding," I said. "But first I need to get my jewelry back." Friday evening arrived with a heavy blanket of storm clouds rolling over the affluent suburbs. I sat in my parked car 2 blocks away from Patricia's sprawling colonial estate. The street was perfectly quiet, lined with manicured hedges and expensive imported vehicles. I knew exactly where the owners of this particular house were. Thomas, Valerie, Greg, and Patricia were currently sitting in the private dining room of the Oak Ridge Country Club. They were drinking top-shelf wine at a lavish rehearsal dinner, celebrating a wedding funded entirely by stolen money and deceit. I was not invited to the rehearsal dinner. That was perfectly fine with me. I had an entirely different engagement. I stepped out of my car wearing a dark trench coat and comfortable soft-soled shoes. I carried a sleek leather tote bag over my shoulder. I walked briskly down the sidewalk, blending into the evening shadows. I was not nervous. During my 30 years as a criminal investigator for the Internal Revenue Service, I had participated in dozens of physical asset seizures. I knew how to control my breathing. I knew how to execute a plan with absolute precision. I approached Patricia's front door. 10 years ago, when Valerie and Thomas first bought their own house, Patricia had insisted on giving me a spare key to her place. She claimed it was for extreme emergencies, a theatrical gesture meant to show off how heavily she relied on a premium home security system. She had boasted that the physical key was useless without the alarm code, but Patricia was a creature of profound vanity and absolute predictability. She had used the same alarm code for the past 15 years. It was the last 2 digits of her birth year, followed by her month. I slid the brass key into the lock, turned it, and stepped inside. The alarm panel immediately began a steady warning beep. I punched in the 4-digit sequence without hesitation. The panel flashed green and went completely silent. I locked the front door behind me and slipped a pair of thin latex gloves onto my hands. I was not a common burglar. I was a federal auditor conducting an unannounced field inspection. The house smelled of overpowering expensive floral perfume and synthetic lemon polish. Patricia had decorated her home like a museum dedicated to her own imagined grandeur. Oversized crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Gilded mirrors lined the hallways. It was a monument to wealth she did not actually possess. I did not waste time looking through the downstairs rooms. Financial predators like my son and his mother-in-law always kept their most prized secrets close to where they slept. I climbed the sweeping mahogany staircase and walked directly into the master suite. The room was aggressively decorated in shades of gold and cream. I walked straight past the enormous 4-poster bed and entered the expansive walk-in closet. The space was the size of a standard bedroom filled with rows of designer handbags and luxury shoes bought with other people's hard-earned money. I scanned the layout carefully. People who obsess over outward appearances always hide their safes behind something reflective. I moved toward a massive full-length mirror mounted on the back wall. I curled my fingers around the wooden frame and pulled. It swung open on hidden hinges. A heavy flush-mounted digital wall safe stared back at me. It featured a smooth, glowing touchscreen keypad. I smiled. Patricia was far too scatterbrained to manage a complex digital security vault on her own. Thomas was the one who managed all the technical installations for the family, and Thomas, despite his arrogant belief in his own genius, was fundamentally lazy. He used the exact same numerical combination for his home alarm, his garage door, and his private office. It was the date of his wedding anniversary to Valerie. I tapped the glass screen to wake the system. I entered the 6-digit sequence. A tiny green light blinked. A mechanical lock clicked deeply inside the wall. I turned the heavy steel handle and pulled the heavy door wide open. The interior of the safe was packed. Resting on the bottom shelf was the unmistakable black velvet box belonging to my late husband. I picked it up and flipped the lid open. The vintage platinum chain and the massive teardrop sapphire stared back at me, flanked by the 2 flawless diamonds. Seeing the necklace again sent a sharp, painful ache through my chest. Arthur had designed this piece with such profound love. Patricia had worn it like a cheap trophy. I closed the box and placed it gently into my leather tote bag. I turned my attention back to the middle shelf. Lying flat was the heavy fireproof document envelope Thomas had stolen from my study. I checked the contents. The original property deed to my summer cabin on Lake Tahoe was safely inside, completely untouched. Beside it sat the thick sealed plastic sleeve containing my $200,000 in municipal bearer bonds. I slid both items into my bag. As I lifted the bond sleeve, a folded yellow carbon copy receipt slid from beneath it and landed against the steel shelf. I recognized the name of a high-end pawn and estate jewelry shop, Patricia's signature at the bottom, and serial numbers that matched 2 of my bonds. I did not stop to study it there. I folded the receipt once, placed it inside the zippered pocket of my tote, and kept moving. Whatever Patricia had tried to do with those bonds, the paper would matter later. But I was not finished. I knew Greg and Thomas needed a place to hide the physical evidence of their massive church investment fraud. They would never keep those documents at Greg's law firm, where junior partners or legal assistants might stumble upon them. They would stash the real numbers in a place they believed was entirely secure and completely disconnected from their professional lives. On the top shelf of Patricia's safe sat a thick black leather ledger and a stack of printed banking spreadsheets secured with a heavy rubber binder. I pulled the ledger out and opened it. My heart beat a steady rhythm as my eyes scanned the columns. It was all there. Greg had meticulously documented every single stolen dollar from the Church Youth Ministry Fund and the congregation retirement accounts. He had tracked exactly which dummy corporations received the funds and how much they had subsequently lost in the stock market. It was a masterclass in criminal stupidity. They had essentially written a comprehensive confession and locked it in a wall safe. I dropped the ledger and the spreadsheets into my tote bag. I had retrieved every single stolen asset and secured the exact weapon I needed to destroy their entire criminal enterprise. I stepped back out of the closet and walked downstairs to the massive imported marble kitchen island. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out the empty black velvet box. I set it squarely in the dead center of the pristine countertop. Next to the empty jewelry box, I placed a single sheet of bright white paper. I had printed it from my home office before making the drive. It was a direct high-resolution photocopy of Title 26 United States Code Section 7201, the federal statute for tax evasion. I did not take anything else from the house. I did not touch a single designer purse or piece of silver. I left the house perfectly pristine except for the terrifying message waiting on the kitchen island. When Patricia returned from her lavish rehearsal dinner, she would find her security system untouched and her front door locked. But she would walk into her kitchen and see the empty velvet box. She would know instantly that her safe had been breached. She would read the federal statute and understand that a predator far more dangerous than she could ever imagine was currently hunting her family. The psychological terror of that realization would paralyze her. Before I left, I used my phone to photograph the open safe, the empty spaces where my property had been stored, and the untouched rooms surrounding it. I recorded the time and then returned every drawer, door, and mirror to the position in which I had found them. Patricia would almost certainly accuse me of breaking into her home and stealing from her. I wanted a clean record showing that I had recovered identifiable property taken from my own safe and preserved documents tied to the fraud, while leaving her unrelated valuables untouched. The habit was almost automatic. When a dispute is built on lies, memory becomes a battlefield. Photographs, timestamps, serial numbers, and original paper do not care who sounds more convincing. I locked the front door behind me and walked briskly back to my car. I drove home through the dark, quiet streets, my mind buzzing with sharp, calculating energy. I arrived at my house, locked the doors, and went straight to my home office. I poured myself a strong cup of black coffee. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. It was time to prime the final trap. I spent the next 2 hours compiling a masterful digital dossier. I scanned every page of the stolen black leather ledger. I organized the fake bank statements Greg had drafted for my conservatorship case. I uploaded the audio recording of Thomas admitting he had attempted to move $500,000 of my money to keep it safe. I attached the church investment prospectuses Caleb had pulled from the public database. I linked every single piece of evidence into a beautifully formatted, undeniable timeline of elder abuse, wire fraud, and grand larceny. Then I opened a secure federal portal and filled out Form 3949A. It is the official information referral document used by the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division to track massive financial crimes. I attached the entire digital dossier to the secure submission file. I picked up my mobile phone and dialed a number I had not called in 3 years. The phone rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. David Stanton speaking. David, I said, keeping my tone crisp and professional. It is Helen. I am sorry to call you so late on a Friday evening. Helen, David said, his voice warming instantly with genuine affection. My favorite auditor, it has been far too long. Are you finally calling to tell me you are bored with retirement and want your old badge back? I smiled. David had been my partner at the Criminal Investigation Division for 15 years. We had dismantled tax shelters and arrested fraudulent executives together. He was currently the regional director of the federal task force. Actually, David, I replied, I am calling to hand you the easiest multi-million-dollar bust of your entire career. I just submitted a comprehensive information referral through the secure portal. I need you to open it right now. I heard the sound of typing through the receiver. David was silent for 3 long minutes as he reviewed the executive summary I had prepared. I could hear his breathing change as he processed the magnitude of the evidence. Helen, David said, his voice dropping into a serious, heavily guarded tone. You have an attempted elder fraud case targeting a $6 million estate layered directly on top of a multi-million-dollar church Ponzi scheme. The paper trail here is absolutely flawless. You handed me the entire shell company network on a silver platter, but the perpetrators listed here. Helen, these are your family members. This is your son. I know exactly who they are, David, I said, my voice completely unwavering. They diagnosed me with a failing mind. They planned to lock me in a facility and steal everything I spent my life building. They stole from innocent church elders to fund a luxury wedding. I am not calling you for sympathy. I am calling you to coordinate an immediate asset seizure. I understand, David said. The fierce loyalty in his voice was palpable. We have active documented wire fraud across state lines and concrete proof of embezzlement. I can get a federal judge to sign the arrest warrants and asset freeze orders by tomorrow morning. Where do you want to do this? Tomorrow evening, I instructed. Greg is hosting a $150,000 wedding reception for his daughter at the Oak Ridge Country Club. Every single wealthy church investor will be sitting in the grand ballroom. Thomas and Patricia will be at the head table. If you arrest them quietly on a Monday morning, the stolen money disappears into a long legal vacuum. We have to dismantle the scheme publicly in front of the victims to force immediate restitution. Consider it done, David said. I will assign a discreet task force. We will arrive early and coordinate with the venue management. My agents will be dressed in standard catering uniforms and venue security attire. We will secure all the exits and wait for your signal. You just make sure you are standing completely clear of the blast zone when the walls come down. I will be perfectly fine, David, I said. Thank you. I hung up the phone. The trap was officially set. The federal warrants were being drafted. The evidence was secured. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet. I reached past my conservative daily wear and pulled out an elegant floor-length emerald green gown I had purchased years ago for a formal gala. I laid it carefully across my bed. Tomorrow I was going to attend a beautiful, wildly expensive wedding. I was going to wear my vintage sapphire necklace, and I was going to watch my son lose absolutely everything. Saturday evening descended on the Oak Ridge Country Club with a crisp and expensive breeze. The grand ballroom of the venue was a staggering monument to stolen money and boundless arrogance. I handed my car keys to the valet and walked slowly up the sweeping marble staircase toward the main entrance. I could hear the elegant strains of a live string quartet drifting through the open terrace doors. Inside, the space had been transformed into an extravagant woodland fantasy. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded from the vaulted ceilings. A massive ice sculpture shaped like two interlocking swans dominated the center of the room. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos circulated gracefully through the crowd, balancing silver trays piled high with expensive caviar and premium truffles. I paused at the threshold of the ballroom to take in the sheer scale of the financial crime occurring right in front of me. At least 150 guests were mingling near the open bar. I recognized dozens of them immediately. They were the wealthy, devout elders from my son's suburban church. They were good, hard-working people who had spent their lives building businesses and saving for retirement. They were currently sipping custom-crafted cocktails and marveling at the gorgeous reception, completely unaware that their own depleted youth ministry funds and vanished retirement accounts had paid for the very champagne they were drinking. I checked my reflection in the polished glass of the entryway doors. I was not wearing the conservative, neutral-toned blazers I usually favored. I was wearing an elegant, floor-length emerald green gown that draped perfectly across my shoulders. And resting heavily against my collarbone was the unmistakable vintage platinum chain holding my massive teardrop sapphire. The deep, brilliant blue of the gemstone caught the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead, flanked by the two flawless diamonds that my late husband had spent months sourcing. I looked radiant. I looked powerful. I looked like a woman arriving to deliver a devastating verdict. I stepped into the ballroom and began walking through the crowd. Several of the church elders spotted me immediately. They smiled warmly, reaching out to shake my hand and offer kind words about Greg's daughter's beautiful wedding. I greeted them all with genuine grace, thanking them for their kind words and making polite, brief conversation. I did not rush. I let my presence ripple naturally through the room, knowing exactly what kind of shockwave I was about to create. Across the room, standing near a towering 12-tier champagne fountain, was Patricia. She was wearing a violently bright pink gown, holding court with a group of older women gesturing dramatically with a crystal flute in her hand. She was basking in the glow of high society, playing the role of the wealthy matriarch to absolute perfection. I adjusted my path and walked directly toward her line of sight. Patricia turned her head to laugh at a joke someone had made. Her eyes casually swept across the dance floor and landed directly on me. I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still under the bright glow of a chandelier, ensuring the light caught the sapphire necklace at the exact right angle. The reaction was instantaneous and physically violent. Patricia's mouth fell open. The blood drained from her face so fast she looked like she might collapse into the floral arrangements. Her hand began to tremble violently. The crystal champagne flute slipped straight through her fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, piercing crash, sending shattered glass and expensive alcohol splashing across the shoes of her wealthy friends. "Oh my goodness, Patricia," one of the women gasped, jumping backward to avoid the spill. "Are you quite all right?" Patricia could not answer. She could not breathe. She simply stared at my neck, her eyes wide with a level of absolute psychological terror that I found deeply satisfying. She knew instantly that her impenetrable home security system had failed. She knew her digital wall safe had been breached. She knew the empty velvet box was waiting for her on her kitchen island, alongside the federal statute for tax fraud. Her sudden panic caught the attention of Thomas, who had been standing near the head table talking to the wedding photographer. Thomas followed Patricia's terrified gaze across the room. When he saw me standing there wearing the emerald gown and the stolen sapphire, his face turned a deep mottled shade of crimson. Thomas excused himself from the photographer and marched directly across the ballroom floor. He ignored the shattered glass near Patricia and grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging into my skin with aggressive, panicked force. "What are you doing here?" Thomas hissed, his voice dropping into a furious, venomous whisper. "Who invited you? And where in the world did you get that necklace?" I did not flinch. I did not pull my arm away. I looked calmly down at his gripping hand and then looked directly into his desperate, sweating face. "I found it exactly where it belonged," I replied, my voice completely smooth and dangerously quiet. I smoothed a non-existent wrinkle on the lapel of his tuxedo. "It is a beautiful reception, Thomas. Are you ready for your big toast?" The sheer panic radiating from my son was almost a physical force in the air. He released my arm as if he had been burned. He realized in that exact moment that the frail, senile old woman he had tried to manipulate was an absolute fiction. He backed away from me, his eyes darting frantically around the ballroom as he desperately searched for the venue security team. I watched him scramble toward a group of men wearing black suits and discreet earpieces stationed near the main kitchen doors. Thomas began whispering urgently to the head of security, pointing a shaky finger directly at me. I could easily read his body language from across the room. He was telling them that I was an uninvited guest. He was explaining that I suffered from severe dementia, that I was experiencing a highly disruptive psychological episode, and that I needed to be quietly and forcefully escorted off the premises for my own safety. 2 large security guards nodded and began walking purposefully across the dance floor toward me. Their expressions were stern and professional. They were fully prepared to physically remove a struggling, confused elderly woman from the reception. Before they could close the distance, a tall, confident figure stepped directly into their path. It was my 19-year-old grandson, Caleb. He was wearing a sharp black suit, his posture completely rigid and authoritative. Caleb held up his hand, stopping the security guards in their tracks. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out his state identification card, alongside a thick, officially stamped venue contract. "There is absolutely no problem here, gentlemen," Caleb said, his voice carrying a calm, unwavering authority that he had never possessed before. "That woman is my grandmother. She is the primary financial backer of this entire family estate. If you lay a single finger on her or attempt to remove her from this room, I will personally ensure this country club faces a massive civil rights lawsuit before midnight." The security guards paused, exchanging uncertain glances. They looked at Caleb's documentation, then looked over at Thomas, who was watching the interception with absolute horror. The head of security tapped his earpiece, nodded at Caleb respectfully, and signaled his men to stand down. They retreated to the perimeter of the room. Thomas was entirely thwarted. His own son had just openly defied him to protect my presence in the ballroom. I gave Caleb a subtle, proud nod from across the room. He had executed his role perfectly, but the confrontation was far from over. A heavy hand suddenly clamped down on my elbow. I turned to find Greg standing right beside me. The slick real estate attorney was sweating profusely, his expensive silk tie slightly askew. He did not bother with fake pleasantries. He yanked me forcefully toward a secluded, dimly lit alcove located near the restroom corridor, away from the prying eyes of the church congregation. Listen to me very carefully, Helen Gregg sneered, crowding into my personal space in a blatant attempt at physical intimidation. I do not know how you got into Patricia's house, and I do not know what kind of game you think you are playing right now. But you are going to walk out those front doors this second. If you utter a single word to anyone in this room, I will have a judge sign an emergency psychiatric hold by Monday morning. I will have you strapped to a hospital bed and locked in a state-run facility for the rest of your miserable life. Do you understand me? I did not step back. I held my ground, looking up at the desperate, pathetic man who had orchestrated the theft of my legacy. I reached up with both hands and slowly, deliberately straightened his crooked silk tie. You really should not make promises with money you do not have. Greg, I whispered, my voice dripping with icy condescension. And you certainly should not threaten a former federal auditor who has spent the last 48 hours tracking every single dummy corporation registered to your home address. Enjoy the champagne. It is going to be the last decent drink you have for a very long time. I stepped around him and walked back into the bright light of the grand ballroom, leaving Greg standing in the shadows, his face frozen in absolute paralyzing terror. At that exact moment, the live string quartet brought their music to a graceful close. The sudden quiet signaled a shift in the evening's events. The master of ceremonies stepped up to a small, elegantly decorated stage near the head table. He tapped a microphone, the sharp feedback echoing through the cavernous space. Ladies and gentlemen, the master of ceremonies announced, his voice booming over the speakers. If I could please have your attention, we are going to pause the music for just a few moments to allow the father of the bride to say a few words. Please welcome Thomas to the stage. A polite, enthusiastic round of applause erupted from the crowd of wealthy church members. Thomas slowly made his way to the stage. His face was slick with a heavy layer of nervous sweat. He gripped the microphone stand with white knuckles, his hands trembling visibly under the bright spotlight. He looked out at the audience, his eyes darting frantically toward the back doors, searching for an escape route that did not exist. He cleared his throat, forcing a wide, completely synthetic smile onto his face. He began to speak, his voice wavering slightly before he found his rhythm. "Thank you," Thomas said, projecting his voice across the room. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Looking out at this room, seeing so many members of our beloved church congregation, I am reminded of the profound importance of community. I am reminded of the values of honesty, of faith, and of the incredible legacy that our elders have built for us." The sheer, sickening hypocrisy of his words was almost difficult to endure. He was standing on a stage paid for by stolen youth ministry funds, preaching about honesty to the very people he had systematically defrauded. He spoke about family values and trust, painting himself as a devoted, loving father and a pillar of the community. I stood near the edge of the dance floor watching the performance. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the catering staff. Several men and women wearing crisp white shirts and black aprons had quietly positioned themselves near every single exit in the ballroom. They were not carrying trays of food. They were standing perfectly still, watching the stage with sharp clinical focus. David's undercover federal agents were officially in place. The trap was fully primed. I waited for Thomas to finish his nauseating speech about family legacy. The moment the crowd began to applaud, I began walking toward the stage. It was time to conduct my final audit. The applause rolled through the grand ballroom like a massive wave of manufactured adoration. Thomas stood at the center of the stage, soaking in the adulation. He offered a humble nod to the crowd of wealthy church investors. He truly believed he had won. He believed his hypocritical speech about family values had cemented his reputation and secured his financial survival. He lowered the microphone and prepared to step down from the dais. I did not give him the chance to leave the spotlight. I stepped out from the shadows near the edge of the dance floor. The heavy silk of my emerald green gown brushed quietly against the polished hardwood. I walked with the slow and deliberate posture of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to hide. Every step I took was measured. The crystal chandeliers caught the brilliant blue light of my stolen sapphire necklace, casting sharp reflections across the entire room. Thomas saw me approaching the short staircase that led up to the stage. His false smile instantly collapsed into a mask of pure terror. He rushed to the edge of the platform and leaned down. He extended a trembling hand as if to block my path. "Mom, please go sit down," Thomas hissed in a desperate whisper, meant only for me. "You are confused. You do not know what you are doing." I did not break my stride. I placed my hand firmly on the polished wooden handrail and ascended the first step. Thomas moved to physically block my way, but a booming voice echoed from the front row. It was Elder Harrison, the senior chairman of the Church Finance Committee. "Let your mother come up," Thomas Elder Harrison called out with a warm and encouraging smile. "She has raised a wonderful son. We would be absolutely honored to hear a few words from the matriarch of the family on such a special night." Thomas was trapped. He could not forcefully push an elderly woman down the stairs in front of his most lucrative marks. He stepped back nervously, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. I glided past him and took my place at the center of the stage. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the cool metal of the microphone stand. I adjusted the height. A brief, sharp screech of audio feedback pierced the room, commanding the absolute attention of every single guest. The grand ballroom fell completely silent. Hundreds of faces looked up at me with polite expectation. I let my gaze sweep across the room. I saw Greg standing near the open bar, clutching a white cloth napkin so tightly his knuckles had lost all color. I saw Patricia sinking lower into her chair at the head table. Then I looked directly at the bride and groom. "I want to start by congratulating the newlyweds," I said. My voice echoed through the massive venue, carrying a warm and grandmotherly tone. "You both look absolutely stunning tonight. This reception is truly a breathtaking sight. The imported orchids are magnificent. The live string quartet has played beautifully. And this towering swan ice sculpture in the center of the room is a remarkable piece of art." A soft ripple of polite agreement murmured through the crowd. I smiled warmly. Then I let that sweet smile completely vanish. I straightened my spine. I dropped the grandmotherly persona entirely. My voice shifted into the crisp, authoritative, and razor-sharp tone of a federal tax auditor. "You all know me simply as Thomas's mother," I said, projecting my words with icy precision. "But there is a significant portion of my life that Thomas and Greg have conveniently left out of their introductions. For 30 years, I worked for the Internal Revenue Service. I was a senior certified public accountant and a lead investigator for the Criminal Investigation Division. My entire career was dedicated to tracking down corporate fraud, dismantling offshore shell companies, and burying financial predators under mountains of their own evidence." The polite smiles in the audience began to falter. A wave of profound confusion washed over the grand ballroom. People shifted uncomfortably in their expensive seats. Thomas let out a strangled gasp and took a step toward me, but I held up my hand to stop him dead in his tracks. I opened my small evening clutch. I reached inside and pulled out the thick black leather ledger I had retrieved from Patricia's hidden wall safe. I held the black book high in the air for the entire room to see. "I want to personally thank Greg and Thomas for hosting this incredible $150,000 wedding reception," I continued. My voice sliced through the tension in the room like a surgical scalpel. "It is a stunning display of wealth. But as a career auditor, I believe firmly in absolute transparency. I feel it is only fair that the church elders sitting right here at table 4 know exactly how this lavish party was funded." I opened the black leather ledger to a page I had marked with a bright red sticky note. I looked directly into the eyes of Elder Harrison. According to the handwritten accounting records on page 42 of Greg's private ledger, I announced clearly, that magnificent ice sculpture and the premium champagne tower were paid for directly using the diverted capital from your Children's Youth Ministry Fund. The imported white orchids hanging from the ceiling were purchased using $60,000 stolen straight from the church building expansion account. I turned the page of the ledger. The silence in the room was no longer polite. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a bomb waiting to detonate. I read off the next set of numbers without a single tremor in my voice. "Furthermore," I said, projecting my words to the back of the room, "the catering bill for the 5-course meal you are all currently enjoying was settled yesterday morning. The funds were wired from a dummy corporation registered to Greg's home address. That specific corporation was capitalized entirely by the private retirement accounts of 12 different senior congregation members sitting in this very room. They did not invest your money into commercial real estate developments. They lost your life savings in highly leveraged stock options, and they are using the last remaining scraps of your retirement to pay for this venue." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Chairs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor as several men stood up in shock. Elder Harrison dropped his cloth napkin onto his plate, his face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and rising fury. He looked from me to Thomas and then over to Greg, who was practically shrinking into the shadows near the bar. "This entire wedding is a masterclass in financial deception," I concluded, snapping the heavy black ledger shut with a loud, definitive thud. "You are not celebrating a family union tonight. You are sitting inside a fully funded crime scene." The momentary shock that had paralyzed Thomas finally shattered. Total panic overrode his self-preservation instincts. He let out a furious, desperate scream and lunged across the stage toward me. "She is sick!" Thomas bellowed into the microphone, trying to physically wrestle the heavy metal stand away from my grip. "Do not listen to a single word she says. My mother has severe dementia. She is suffering from a massive psychological breakdown. She is completely delusional. Someone call security and get her off this stage right now." I did not fight him for the microphone. I simply released my hold on the stand and stepped back smoothly, gracefully, yielding the center of the stage. I looked up toward the darkened audio-visual booth situated on the second-floor balcony overlooking the ballroom. I gave a single sharp nod. My grandson Caleb was sitting alone inside that booth. He had bypassed the venue security and locked the heavy soundproof door behind him. He was waiting for my exact signal. Caleb slammed his hand down on the master control console. The soft, romantic lighting in the grand ballroom instantly cut to a harsh, bright white. The gentle instrumental music playing through the venue speakers died completely. The massive dual projector screens flanking the stage had been displaying a heartwarming slideshow of the bride and groom. The smiling wedding photos vanished in a fraction of a second. They were instantly replaced by high-definition digital images. The screens lit up with the undeniable concrete proof of a multi-million-dollar fraud ring. On the left screen, Caleb projected the internal bank transfer logs we had uncovered. Huge red circles highlighted the exact routing numbers linking the church youth ministry accounts directly to Greg's personal limited liability companies. The dates and the dollar amounts matched my accusations perfectly. On the right screen, Caleb displayed the fraudulent conservatorship documents Thomas had attempted to force me to sign. He placed their prepared signature page beside a photograph of the blank, heat-erased decoy they carried away showing their attempt to seize control of my estate. Thomas spun around to look at the massive screens. The color completely drained from his face as his darkest secrets were broadcast in 10-foot-tall letters for his entire social circle to see. But the visual evidence was only the beginning. Caleb reached over and engaged the primary audio feed, pushing the volume sliders to their maximum limit. The sound of a quiet suburban living room echoed out of the massive concert speakers filling the cavernous ballroom. It was the recording I had secretly captured on my phone during their failed family intervention ambush. Thomas's own voice boomed from the speakers, loud, crisp, and undeniably clear. "Yes, Mom, I tried to move the $500,000. I was trying to save you from yourself. You cannot manage that kind of wealth anymore. Greg has the permanent conservatorship paperwork ready to file with a judge tomorrow morning." The recording continued playing. Thomas's voice continued with the threat of assisted living and a forced evaluation. Then Greg justified moving my money into his law firm, and Patricia claimed my stolen sapphire came from a local estate sale. The grand ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The polite high society facade completely disintegrated. The church elders stood up shouting in outrage and demanding answers. Several duped investors rushed toward the stage, their faces red with fury. Valerie stood frozen at the head table, covering her face with her hands and screaming that she knew absolutely nothing about the stolen money. She was desperately trying to distance herself from the catastrophic collapse of her husband's empire. Thomas dropped the microphone. It hit the wooden stage floor with a loud, piercing squeal of feedback. He stumbled backward, holding his hands up in a pathetic attempt to pacify the advancing crowd of furious victims. "Please," Thomas begged, his voice cracking with pure terror. "Please, everyone, just stay calm. It is a misunderstanding. I can explain the market volatility. We were going to pay it all back." No one was listening to him. The anger in the room was a living, breathing entity. Across the ballroom, Patricia realized that her entire world of manufactured luxury had just evaporated. The wealthy friends she had spent years trying to impress were now looking at her with absolute disgust. She saw the furious church members advancing toward the stage, and she made a split-second decision to save herself. Patricia grabbed her expensive designer wrap from the back of her chair. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. She scurried along the edge of the floral arrangements, moving as quickly as her heavy evening gown would allow. She bypassed the main entrance and headed directly for the heavy oak doors at the back of the venue, aiming for the private valet exit. She reached the heavy wooden doors and pushed her weight against the brass handle. She expected to slip out into the cool night air and disappear into the safety of the dark parking lot. The door swung open, but Patricia did not take a single step outside. She stopped dead in her tracks, letting out a sharp, terrified gasp. Standing shoulder to shoulder blocking the entire exit ramp was a solid wall of men and women. They were wearing standard catering uniforms and venue security attire, but their posture gave them away instantly. They were not there to serve cake or check event tickets. They stood with the rigid, unyielding stance of federal law enforcement agents. The trap I had carefully primed was now officially and irreversibly sprung. There was absolutely no escape for any of them. The massive oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom remained entirely unyielding. Patricia shoved her full body weight against the polished brass handles for a second time, but the heavy wood did not move a single inch. She let out a sharp gasp of frustration. She turned around to face the ballroom and realized her escape route was permanently severed. The individuals blocking the exit were not standard catering staff or country club security guards. They were highly trained federal agents. David Stanton stepped into the bright light of the crystal chandeliers. He wore a crisp, dark suit and carried a commanding presence that instantly silenced the immediate area. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his leather credential case. He flipped it open, revealing a gleaming gold badge. "Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division," David announced. His voice was deep and carrying effortlessly over the chaotic murmurs of the stunned wedding guests. "We are securing this venue. Nobody leaves this room until we have completed our processing." The ensuing silence was absolute and suffocating. The wealthy church elders who had been shouting in outrage just moments before now stood perfectly still. They watched in sheer disbelief as the carefully constructed facade of high society elegance collapsed into a highly coordinated federal raid. At the front of the ballroom, Greg tried to salvage his crumbling empire. He drew upon his years of experience as a slick real estate attorney and attempted to project a false aura of legal indignation. He straightened his expensive silk tie and marched toward the edge of the stage. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Greg demanded loudly. He pointed an accusatory finger at David. "You have absolutely no jurisdiction here to interrupt a private family event. I am a licensed attorney, and I demand to see a signed warrant before you take another step into this room." David did not even break his stride. He walked directly down the center aisle of the ballroom, flanked by 4 heavily armed agents. He reached inside his jacket and produced a thick stack of folded legal documents. "I have 3 separate warrants right here," David replied calmly. "They were signed by a federal judge at 7 o'clock this morning. We received a highly detailed information referral outlining a massive interconnected web of wire fraud, tax evasion, and grand larceny. Your dummy corporations have been fully mapped and every single one of your accounts is currently frozen." Greg lost all color in his face. His arrogant courtroom persona completely evaporated. He stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the edge of the towering swan ice sculpture. The frozen artwork was already beginning to melt, sending drops of cold water pooling around his expensive leather shoes. 2 federal agents flanked Greg immediately. One of them grabbed his wrist and firmly pulled his arm behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of metal handcuffs echoed loudly across the silent dance floor. Greg squeezed his eyes shut tight. He did not utter another word of protest. He simply hung his head in absolute defeat. Thomas watched his brother-in-law get arrested and fell into a state of sheer, mindless panic. He scrambled away from the stage and tried to blend into a group of stunned church members. It was a pathetic and futile gesture. 2 more agents intercepted him before he could make it 3 steps. They grabbed him by the shoulders and spun him around to face the room. "Thomas Montgomery," one agent stated clearly, "you are under arrest for identity theft, unauthorized wire fraud, and attempted elder financial exploitation. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." As the cold steel cuffs locked around Thomas's wrists, Valerie finally broke her stunned silence. She had been standing frozen near the head table, clutching her champagne flute. When she saw the agents restraining her husband, she let out a piercing theatrical scream. "Get away from me!" Valerie shrieked, backing away from Thomas as quickly as her designer heels would allow. "I had absolutely nothing to do with any of this. I did not know where the money came from. He lied to me. He told me his investment firm was paying out massive bonuses. I am completely innocent." Valerie was desperately trying to save her own skin by throwing her husband directly to the federal wolves. She waved her arms frantically, claiming total ignorance of the entire financial conspiracy. Thomas looked at his wife with a mixture of betrayal and absolute despair. His entire family unit was disintegrating in real time. I stood calmly near the edge of the dance floor, watching the arrests unfold. I smoothed the fabric of my emerald green gown and took a slow, deliberate breath. I walked forward until I was standing just 2 feet away from my handcuffed son. Thomas looked up at me. His eyes were wide and filled with desperate, pleading tears. The arrogant man who had laughed while drinking $300 champagne on my birthday was completely gone. "Mom, please," Thomas begged. His voice cracked with genuine terror. "Mom, please tell them to stop. I am your son. I am your only child. You cannot let them take me away like this. I will give everything back. I promise I will fix it. Please do not do this to me." I looked at him. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy. I felt only the cold, hard reality of justice. "You sat in my living room and diagnosed me with a failing mind," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried a sharp, unforgiving edge. "You tried to convince the world that I was a fragile, confused old woman who could no longer think clearly. You underestimated my intelligence, and you mocked my legacy. You forgot one very important detail, Thomas. My math has always been absolutely perfect." I turned my back on him, signaling to the agents that our conversation was entirely finished. Thomas sobbed loudly as they escorted him toward the front doors of the country club. The visual contrast of a man in a tailored tuxedo being marched out by federal agents was a stunning display of consequence. Across the grand ballroom, Patricia watched the arrests of her son-in-law and her daughter's husband with mounting panic. She had abandoned her attempt to escape through the back doors when she saw the federal agents blocking the exit. Now she was trapped inside the room, looking desperately for any possible way to deflect the blame away from herself. Patricia scurried toward David Stanton. Her violently bright pink gown rustled loudly against the hardwood floor. She held her hands up in a gesture of pathetic surrender. Her heavy makeup was beginning to run, making her look incredibly foolish under the bright venue lights. "Officer," Patricia cried out, grasping at David's suit sleeve. "You must listen to me. I am a victim here, too. Thomas is a monster. He forced me to wear this jewelry. He gave me these things and told me they were gifts. I had no idea he was stealing from his own mother. I am just a sweet, innocent grandmother caught up in his terrible web of lies." She pointed an accusatory finger toward the main doors, where Thomas had just been escorted out. She was utilizing the exact same survival tactic as her daughter. She was willing to condemn anyone else to save her own lavish lifestyle. I crossed the dance floor and positioned myself between Patricia and the regional task force director. My recovered sapphire rested against my collarbone while Patricia stared at it in naked panic. "That is a fascinating story, Patricia," I said pleasantly, "but it contains a rather massive structural flaw." I opened my small evening clutch and reached inside. I bypassed my lipstick and my reading glasses. I pulled out a single neatly folded piece of yellow carbon copy paper. I held it up between my index and middle fingers, displaying it clearly for David and Patricia to see. "This is a physical receipt from a high-end pawn and estate jewelry shop located exactly 3 miles from your home," I explained. "I retrieved it from your wall safe last night, tucked beneath the stolen bonds." Patricia froze. Her mouth opened, but she could not form a single syllable. "You did not just passively accept stolen gifts," Patricia, I continued. My voice rang with absolute authority. "Last Tuesday afternoon, you took 2 of my municipal bearer bonds to this specific pawn shop. You attempted to liquidate $50,000 of untraceable municipal debt to generate quick cash for this wedding reception. The dealer found the transaction suspicious and required you to sign a sworn declaration of ownership. You signed your own legal name on the bottom line. You voluntarily participated in an attempted liquidation of stolen financial assets." David reached out and took the yellow receipt from my hand. He scanned the signature and the dates. He nodded grimly and looked back at Patricia. The false, innocent grandmother routine completely shattered. Patricia, David stated sharply, "You are under arrest as an accessory to grand larceny and possession of stolen property." Patricia let out a loud, dramatic wail. She tried to pull away, but a female federal agent stepped forward and firmly grabbed her wrists. The agent secured her hands behind her back with a heavy set of metal cuffs. The expensive pink designer gown clashed violently with the cold steel restraints. Patricia looked entirely broken, stripped of every single illusion of wealth and high society status she had spent her life cultivating. As they marched Patricia out of the grand ballroom, I turned around to face the stunned crowd. The lavish wedding reception had completely ceased to exist. The string-quartet instruments were packed away. The champagne tower sat entirely ignored. The venue was now officially an active federal crime scene. Dozens of wealthy church elders stood clustered near the dining tables. They looked completely lost. Their faces were pale with the horrifying realization that their retirement funds and their community youth programs had been completely gutted by the two men they had trusted most in the world. Elder Harrison stepped forward. His hands were shaking slightly as he looked at the empty stage and then back at me. "Helen," Elder Harrison asked. His voice was thick with emotion and profound distress. "Is it true? Is the money really gone? Did they truly steal everything from the congregation?" I looked at the devastated faces of the innocent people who had been caught in the crossfire of my son's limitless greed. I felt a deep wave of compassion for them. They had believed in a lie crafted by a highly skilled manipulator. "The money was stolen." "Elder Harrison," I said, projecting my voice so every single church member could hear me clearly. "Thomas and Greg moved your funds into hidden offshore shell companies to cover their own disastrous financial bets. They tried to bleed you dry." A collective groan of despair rippled through the crowd. Several older women began to quietly weep. They believed their life savings had vanished forever into a legal black hole. "But I am not just a victim in this story," I continued, raising my voice to cut through their rising panic. "I am a forensic tax auditor. I did not just discover the theft. I mapped the entire network. Last night I submitted a comprehensive federal referral that allowed these agents to freeze every single one of Greg and Thomas's hidden accounts before the money could be fully laundered or permanently lost." The weeping stopped. The crowd went completely silent, hanging on to my every word. "Your accounts are currently frozen," I explained, looking directly into Elder Harrison's eyes. "The funds are trapped in a federal holding pattern. But they are not lost. I promise every single person in this room that I will personally dedicate my time and my 30 years of forensic accounting experience to helping the government untangle this web. I will work with the prosecution every single day until every last stolen penny is pulled from Greg's frozen accounts and returned to your community." A profound, heavy sigh of collective relief washed over the grand ballroom. Elder Harrison reached out and took my hands in his own, squeezing them with immense gratitude. Tears filled his eyes as he realized they had been saved from total financial ruin. I stood in the center of the lavish venue, surrounded by the wreckage of my son's criminal empire. The ice sculpture was melting rapidly into a puddle of cold water. The empty champagne glasses sat abandoned on the white tablecloths. They had tried to destroy me on my 70th birthday. They had assumed my age made me an easy target. Instead, I had systematically dismantled their entire lives and secured the return of millions of dollars in stolen funds. I adjusted my vintage sapphire necklace, letting the brilliant blue stone catch the light one final time. The audit was officially complete. Before I left the country club, I surrendered the black ledger, the pawn receipt, the copied bank records, and the audio file to David under a formal evidence log. I kept certified copies for myself, but the originals now belonged in the case. That mattered to me. The night had been dramatic, but the spectacle was never the point. The point was to make sure every accusation I had spoken into that microphone could survive after the chandeliers went dark and the witnesses went home. Greg and Thomas had spent months building a story in which I was confused and unreliable. By midnight, federal investigators possessed a documented chain of evidence strong enough to outlive every excuse they could invent. The fluorescent lights of the federal building hummed with a familiar and comforting energy. 3 weeks had passed since the disastrous wedding reception at the country club. I found myself sitting at a large metal desk inside the secure operations center of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. My tailored suits had been replaced by comfortable slacks and warm cashmere sweaters. I held a steaming cup of black coffee in one hand and a thick yellow highlighter in the other. I was entirely in my element. Spread out before me were hundreds of printed banking statements, wire transfer logs, and offshore incorporation documents. David Stanton had granted me temporary clearance as a consulting forensic expert for the task force. I sat shoulder to shoulder with young and eager federal agents who looked at me with a mixture of intimidation and absolute awe. They possessed advanced algorithms and automated tracking software, but they lacked the instinct forged by 30 years of hunting desperate people. Greg and Thomas had tried to build a labyrinth. They had funneled the stolen church money through a dizzying series of domestic limited liability companies before wiring the capital to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. They believed the sheer volume of the transactions would make the money impossible to trace. They were fundamentally wrong. I spent 10 hours a day hunched over those spreadsheets. I traced every single routing number and matched every hidden deposit against the dates in Greg's stolen black leather ledger. The young agents marveled at my ability to spot the microscopic discrepancies in the tax identification numbers. I showed them how Greg had used fractional cent rounding to skim extra money from the congregation retirement accounts. I pointed out the exact moments Thomas had panicked and made sloppy emergency transfers to cover his failing stock market bets. The most crucial element of the entire recovery operation was the timing. Because I had submitted the information referral form immediately before the wedding reception, the federal government had placed a hard freeze on the international wire channels. Greg and Thomas had intended to convert the remaining church funds into untraceable cryptocurrency on the Monday following the wedding. My preemptive strike had locked the money safely inside the traditional banking system. By the end of the 4th week, we hit the bottom of the financial well. David Stanton walked into the operations center holding a final report. A rare and genuine smile illuminated his face. He placed his hands on my metal desk and leaned forward. He announced to the room that the international authorities had officially complied with their asset seizure requests. The federal government had successfully clawed back 95% of the stolen youth ministry funds and the private retirement accounts. The remaining 5% had been lost to irrecoverable market dips, but the vast majority of the community wealth was entirely safe. The young federal agents in the room actually stood up and applauded. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a profound sense of closure settle over my heart. The following Sunday, I drove to the wealthy suburban church that my son had so callously exploited. I did not go to attend the regular service. I was invited to a special private assembly in the community hall. When I walked through the double doors, the entire finance committee and dozens of elderly congregation members were waiting for me. They did not look at me with the pity or the suspicion one might expect to receive as the mother of a notorious criminal. They looked at me with immense and overwhelming reverence. Elder Harrison stepped forward from the crowd. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. He took both of my hands in his own and squeezed them tightly. He told me that the federal prosecutors had contacted them the day before. The church accounts had been officially replenished. The youth ministry expansion would continue as planned. The elderly couples who had spent weeks crying over their vanished life savings were secure once again. Elder Harrison addressed the room in a thick and emotional voice. He told the congregation that I was a true guardian angel. He said my son had brought darkness into their sanctuary, but I had brought the light of justice to drive it away. Several women approached me to offer warm hugs and heartfelt words of profound gratitude. They thanked me for sacrificing my own family peace to protect their vulnerable community. I stood in that sunlit church hall surrounded by total strangers who treated me with more respect and genuine love than my own flesh and blood ever had. I realized then that family is not defined by genetics. Family is defined by mutual respect, unwavering honesty, and the willingness to protect one another when the wolves begin to circle. Months passed, and the heavy summer heat gradually softened into the crisp air of late autumn. The wheels of the federal justice system turn slowly, but they grind with absolute certainty. I walked through the heavy oak doors of the United States District Courthouse, wearing a sharp charcoal suit. My posture was perfectly straight. My grandson Caleb walked proudly by my side wearing a tailored navy jacket. We took our seats in the second row of the polished mahogany gallery. The sentencing hearing was the culmination of everything we had worked for. Greg had hired a team of incredibly expensive defense attorneys, hoping to find a technical loophole in the federal statutes. Thomas had desperately tried to negotiate a lesser charge by offering to testify against his brother-in-law. But their high-priced legal defense completely crumbled against the impenetrable wall of evidence we had provided. My meticulous physical documentation from the safe combined perfectly with the digital surveillance Caleb had intercepted from their own hidden cameras. The defense attorneys realized they had absolutely no ground to stand on. Facing the terrifying prospect of a 20-year federal sentence if they took the case to trial, both Greg and Thomas capitulated. They begged the prosecution for a plea deal. The judge presiding over the case was a stern older woman with zero tolerance for white-collar predators. She reviewed the extensive files and looked down from her elevated bench with absolute disgust. She addressed Greg and Thomas directly. She called their actions a despicable betrayal of family trust and a parasitic drain on a faithful community. She accepted their guilty pleas for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse. The bang of her wooden gavel echoed loudly through the silent courtroom. She sentenced both of them to 8 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The collateral damage of their criminal enterprise swept through the rest of the family with ruthless efficiency. Patricia faced her own devastating comeuppance. Because she had signed the pawnshop receipt attempting to sell my stolen bearer bonds, the federal agents had charged her as a willing accessory to grand larceny. She avoided prison time by cooperating with the authorities, but the financial penalties completely destroyed her fake high society life. Patricia was forced to liquidate her sprawling colonial mansion, sell her luxury vehicles, and auction off every single designer handbag just to pay her court-mandated restitution. She currently lives in a tiny rundown studio apartment on the industrial side of the city. Her country club friends completely abandoned her the moment her name appeared in the local crime blotter. Valerie proved to be exactly the kind of coward I always knew she was. The moment the federal agents arrested Thomas at the wedding reception, she immediately filed for a highly publicized divorce. She desperately tried to paint herself as a clueless victim. When the local community shunned her for her complicity in the church scandal, she packed her belongings and fled the state in total disgrace. She left no forwarding address and completely abandoned her husband to face his prison sentence entirely alone. I sat in the gallery and watched as the bailiff approached the defense table. Greg was crying silently into his hands. Thomas stood up wearing a drab orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. The arrogance and the entitlement had been entirely stripped away. He looked hollow and deeply aged. The bailiff secured the heavy metal handcuffs around Thomas's wrists and prepared to escort him to the holding cells. Thomas stopped walking. He turned around and looked directly at the gallery. His eyes locked onto mine. The desperation in his gaze was palpable. He spoke softly to the bailiff, asking for a single moment to speak to his mother before he was taken away for 8 years. The bailiff nodded and allowed him to step toward the wooden partition that separated the gallery from the court floor. I stood up slowly and walked down the short aisle until I was standing just a few feet away from my son. The heavy wooden barrier was the only thing between us. Caleb remained in his seat, watching the final interaction with a steady and protective gaze. Thomas looked at me with red and swollen eyes. His voice was a raspy, broken whisper. He did not ask for my forgiveness. He did not offer another pathetic apology. He simply looked at the woman who had systematically destroyed his entire life and asked the one question that had clearly been torturing his mind for months. "Mom," Thomas whispered, gripping the edge of the wooden partition with his chained hands. "How long did you actually know?" I did not answer Thomas in the courtroom. I told him I would give him one final conversation after the sentence settled in. 2 days later, the visitor processing center at the Federal Correctional Institution smelled of harsh industrial bleach and stale coffee. I sat on a hard plastic chair, waiting for my assigned visitation window. The room was stark and entirely devoid of color. Thick cinder block walls painted a depressing shade of institutional gray surrounded me. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer and slacks. My posture remained perfectly straight. I watched the heavy steel security doors at the far end of the room. After 30 minutes, a stern-looking guard called my name. I stood and followed him down a brightly lit corridor. Our footsteps echoed off the bare linoleum floor. I was directed to a small partitioned booth. A thick pane of reinforced glass divided the space, and a black telephone receiver hung beside it. I took my seat on a metal stool. A few moments later, the heavy door on the opposite side of the partition clicked open. Thomas walked into the booth. My breath caught for just a fraction of a second. The arrogant and fast-talking portfolio manager who used to drink vintage champagne at expensive steakhouses had completely vanished. He wore a baggy orange prison uniform that swallowed his frame. His shoulders were slumped in a posture of permanent defeat. The confident swagger had been replaced by a slow and hesitant shuffle. His hair was unkempt, and deep, dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. He sat down heavily on the stool opposite mine. He reached for the black telephone receiver with hands wrapped in heavy metal chains. I picked up my receiver and held it to my ear. I did not speak first. I waited for him to initiate the conversation. Thomas stared at me through the thick glass for a long time. His eyes were red and filled with a profound, crushing despair. He did not offer another pathetic apology. He did not beg me to call my lawyers or petition the judge for a reduced sentence. The reality of his 8-year federal prison term had finally crushed his delusions of grandeur. He looked at the woman who had systematically dismantled his entire criminal empire. He swallowed hard. Mom, Thomas whispered into the receiver. His voice was a raspy, broken sound. I just need to understand one thing before they transfer me to the permanent housing unit. How long did you actually know? I looked at my son. I felt a fleeting, heavy wave of sorrow for the boy I had raised, but that sorrow was immediately washed away by the cold, hard memory of his betrayal. I knew the exact moment you could not be bothered to show up for my 70th birthday, but magically found the time to spend my money, I replied. My voice was crisp and unwavering, transmitted clearly through the electronic line. You sat in a luxury restaurant buying expensive wine for your mother-in-law while lying to my face about a financial crisis. You assumed I was just a frail, lonely widow who would quietly accept your excuses. You thought my advancing age made me weak and oblivious. You made a fatal miscalculation, Thomas. You completely forgot that my age gave me 40 years of professional experience dealing with corporate liars and financial predators. Thomas closed his eyes. A single tear slipped down his hollow cheek. He pressed his forehead against the cold, reinforced glass. You diagnosed me with a failing mind. I continued keeping my tone completely level. You planned to lock me inside a state-run facility and strip me of my dignity just to pay off your gambling debts. You chose greed over your own mother. You made your choices, and now you are sitting exactly where you belong. I did not wait for him to formulate a response. I placed the black receiver gently back onto the wall hook. I stood up from the metal stool. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal blazer. I turned my back on the visitation glass and walked out of the booth. I did not look over my shoulder. I walked out of the federal penitentiary and stepped into the bright morning sunlight. The crisp air filled my lungs. I felt lighter than I had in months. I drove directly from the prison to the sleek downtown offices of my primary wealth management firm. I bypassed the standard teller stations and walked straight into the private suite of my senior portfolio director. His name was William. He was a meticulous man who had managed my municipal bonds and commercial real estate assets for over a decade. I sat down at his polished mahogany conference table and opened my briefcase. William, I said, pulling out a stack of pristine legal documents. We are restructuring my entire estate today. I need to establish a new generation skipping transfer trust. I want it ironclad, irrevocable, and completely impenetrable. William adjusted his silver-framed glasses and nodded eagerly. He had followed the explosive news of the country club arrests and understood exactly why I was taking these drastic measures. I outlined the strict parameters of the new financial vehicle. I completely and permanently disinherited Thomas. I included aggressive spendthrift clauses designed specifically to block Valerie or Patricia from ever attempting to sue the estate for alimony or fabricated emotional damages. I locked the capital behind layers of corporate protections that even a team of high-priced litigators could never pierce. I transferred my entire $6 million portfolio into the newly minted trust. I secured my summer cabin, my municipal bonds, and the liquid cash recovered from the frozen accounts. I ensured that my legacy would survive long after I was gone. But this vast fortune was no longer destined for the son who had betrayed me. I signed the final page of the trust agreement using my favorite permanent ink pen. I shook William by the hand and left the office. My financial empire was officially locked away from the predators. Later that same afternoon, I sat quietly on the wide wooden deck of my back porch. The late autumn weather was cool but pleasant. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the towering oak trees lining my backyard. The dry scent of fallen leaves floated through the air. I held a glass of freshly brewed iced tea, watching the condensation drip slowly down the sides of the crystal tumbler. The profound peace of my home had been entirely restored. The hidden cameras were gone. The deceitful whispers were silenced. The wooden gate at the side of my house clicked open. My grandson Caleb walked up the stone pathway. He wore a simple gray t-shirt and denim jeans. He carried his college backpack over one shoulder. He smiled when he saw me sitting on the porch. I waved him over and pointed to the comfortable wicker chair resting directly across from mine. Caleb sat down and let out a long, exhausted sigh. The past month had taken a heavy toll on him. He had watched his father get hauled away by federal agents. He had watched his mother flee the state in total disgrace. He had stood bravely in the center of a massive storm, but the adrenaline had finally worn off, leaving him drained. I poured him a tall glass of iced tea and slid it across the small patio table. I reached down beside my chair and picked up a thick, dark brown leather portfolio. The leather was smooth and embossed with a subtle gold trim. I placed the heavy portfolio squarely on the table directly in front of Caleb. "What is this, Grandma?" Caleb asked. He wiped the cold condensation from his glass and looked at the leather binder with deep curiosity. "Open it," I instructed gently. Caleb unclasped the leather strap and flipped the heavy cover open. The first page was a certified banking receipt from his university bursar office. He read the document carefully. His eyes widened in absolute shock. He looked up at me, his mouth falling open in disbelief. "You paid my tuition," Caleb stammered. His voice shook with sudden, overwhelming emotion. "Grandma, this receipt says my entire undergraduate program is paid in full. Room, board, and books. You cleared my entire student account." "I did," I replied, offering him a warm and reassuring smile. "Turn to the next page." Caleb flipped the heavy parchment paper. He found a copy of the Generation Skipping Transfer Trust I had executed in William's office just a few hours prior. He read the summary sheet. He saw his own name listed in bold black ink. "I named you the sole beneficiary and the primary executor of my entire estate," I explained, keeping my voice steady and clear. "The trust is completely irrevocable. I placed specific legal stipulations on the capital to guarantee that your parents can never touch a single dime. The money is locked behind a fortress of corporate governance. You will receive a generous monthly living stipend while you finish your degree. When you turn 25, you will gain full administrative control over the real estate assets and the investment portfolios." Caleb stared at the legal documents. His hands began to tremble. A solitary tear escaped his eye and tracked slowly down his cheek. He closed the leather portfolio and rested his hands flat on top of the cover. "Grandma, I do not know what to say," Caleb whispered. His voice was thick with gratitude and lingering guilt. I was so incredibly terrified to go against my own dad. When I found those fake bank statements on his computer, I felt like I was going to throw up. I knew he was planning something terrible, but reporting your own parents feels like a massive betrayal. I felt so guilty for copying his emails. I was so scared of what would happen if he caught me. I reached across the small patio table and placed my hand firmly over his trembling fingers. I looked deeply into his eyes, wanting to ensure he understood the absolute truth of my next words. "You have absolutely nothing to feel guilty about, Caleb," I said. My tone was fiercely protective. "Your father made the decision to become a predator. He chose greed over decency. You chose to protect an innocent person. You showed more courage and integrity at 19 years old than your father showed in his entire adult life. You risked your own safety and your own financial future to warn me about the trap they were building." Caleb wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the validation. He had carried the burden of his father's crimes for months, and he finally felt the crushing pressure begin to lift. "You need to understand something very important about this world," Caleb, I continued softly. I squeezed his hand to emphasize the gravity of the lesson. "People often tell you that family is defined by blood. They tell you that sharing a last name means you owe someone your blind, unwavering loyalty. That is a dangerous lie. Family is not about blood. Family is about who stands firmly by your side when the wolves begin to circle. Your father invited the wolves right into my dining room. You were the one who helped me drive them out." Caleb smiled. It was a genuine, relieved smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He pulled the heavy leather portfolio closer to his chest, holding it like a precious shield. He thanked me again, his voice finally steady and calm. We sat together on the back porch, listening to the quiet rustling of the oak trees and the gentle chirping of the afternoon birds. I leaned back in my wicker chair and took a deep, satisfying breath of the crisp, late autumn air. The massive weight of the betrayal had completely evaporated. The dark, looming shadow of my son's desperate greed was gone. I looked out over the pristine green lawn of my backyard. I had spent 30 years of my life fighting complex financial battles in sterile government office buildings. I had spent the last several months fighting a brutal psychological war inside my own home. But the battle was officially over. I had protected my dignity. I had secured my hard-earned legacy. I had passed the torch to a young man who truly understood the fundamental value of honesty and courage. I sat in the golden sunlight of my garden, finally free of the leeches that had tried to drain my life, and I enjoyed the absolute perfect silence of my restored sanctuary. 6 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom swung shut, sealing my son inside a world of concrete and steel. The transition from the chaotic battlefield of financial warfare to the absolute stillness of my restored daily routine was initially jarring. I had spent weeks operating on pure adrenaline, navigating a labyrinth of offshore shell companies and coordinating massive asset seizures with federal agents. When the dust finally settled and the high-profile criminal trials concluded, I returned to my home in the quiet suburbs. I stood in my kitchen on a random Tuesday morning, listening to the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the cheerful chirping of the robins in my backyard. The profound silence of the house was no longer a canvas for my son to paint his elaborate gaslighting schemes. It was a genuine sanctuary. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee and poured it into my favorite ceramic mug. I walked into my home office and looked at the heavy biometric wall safe hidden behind my coastal landscape painting. The vintage sapphire necklace and my municipal bearer bonds were securely locked inside. The space was completely impenetrable. My life belonged entirely to me once again. I quickly realized that sitting idly in a quiet house was not going to satisfy the sharp, analytical energy that the recent conflict had reawakened inside me. My 30 years as a forensic auditor for the Internal Revenue Service had trained my brain to constantly seek out discrepancies and solve complex puzzles. I needed a purpose that extended beyond my own personal vindication. I contacted a highly respected legal aid clinic located in the downtown district. The organization specialized in providing free legal representation and financial advocacy for vulnerable senior citizens. I offered them my extensive background in corporate tax law and forensic accounting. They welcomed me with open arms. I now volunteer my time 3 days a week, sitting in a brightly lit community center, meeting with elderly men and women who suspect they are being financially exploited. Just yesterday, I sat across a small folding table from an 82-year-old widow. She was trembling as she handed me a stack of highly confusing investment portfolios provided by her newly appointed son-in-law. She told me she could no longer afford her basic utility bills, despite possessing a substantial retirement fund. It took me exactly 15 minutes with a red pen and a desktop calculator to dismantle the dense web of hidden management fees and unauthorized asset transfers her son-in-law had buried in the fine print. I showed her exactly how he was systematically draining her life savings to fund his failing startup company. I helped her draft a legally binding revocation of proxy and connected her immediately with a trusted fraud detective. Watching the fear in her eyes transform into empowered righteous anger was an incredibly beautiful sight. I am taking the brutal lessons I learned from my own family and using them to build an impenetrable fortress around other vulnerable seniors. I am ensuring that the predators who view the elderly as easy targets are met with absolute devastating resistance. Despite the deep satisfaction I find in my new advocacy work, the quiet hours of the evening often force me to confront the complicated emotional wreckage of my personal life. The grief of losing a child is a universally acknowledged tragedy, but mourning a child who is still breathing is a very different, uniquely agonizing kind of sorrow. I did not lose Thomas to a terrible medical illness or a tragic highway accident. I lost my only son to his own insatiable, boundless greed. He willingly chose to trade my safety and my dignity for country club memberships and vintage champagne. He looked at the mother who had raised him and saw nothing more than an obstacle standing between him and a $6 million payday. There are moments when I look at old photograph albums and see the smiling face of the little boy who used to help me plant tomatoes in the garden. I feel a sharp, sudden ache in my chest when I remember how he used to hug me and tell me I was the smartest woman in the world. But I have learned to separate the ghost of that innocent child from the reality of the ruthless financial predator he became. The son I loved died a long time ago, long before he ever stepped foot inside that federal courtroom. I have not visited him again since that one final conversation through the glass. I do not send letters or put money into his prison commissary account. I refuse to expose myself to his inevitable manipulations and his manufactured remorse. I balance the ledger of my heart, the exact same way I balance a complex tax portfolio. I acknowledge the heavy, painful debits of the betrayal, but I focus entirely on the massive credits of my survival. I took back absolute control of my life. I protected my brave 19-year-old grandson from being dragged down into the criminal underworld by his own parents. Caleb is currently thriving at his university, completely free from the toxic environment his mother and father created. We speak on the phone twice a week, and he visits me every single Sunday for dinner. We do not talk about the prison sentences or the ruined wedding. We talk about his upcoming final exams, his new friends, and his plans for the future. He is the true legacy of our family, and I am profoundly grateful that I was able to secure his future. When I look back on the entire staggering ordeal, I am amazed by the sheer audacity of the people who tried to destroy me. It is almost comical to retrace the steps of their monumental failure. The entire sequence of events plays out in my mind like a brilliantly directed cinematic feature. It all started with a quiet, empty chair at an upscale steakhouse on my 70th birthday. Thomas had sent that pathetic lying text message claiming a massive corporate crisis. I can still vividly recall the taste of my dry martini as I looked across the crowded dining room and saw him laughing with Valerie and Patricia. I remember the absolute frozen terror on his face when I tapped his shoulder and whispered that I was happy to cover the $900 bill. They thought they were so incredibly clever. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect psychological trap. Valerie hiding my mail and unplugging my kitchen appliances to manufacture a fake medical history of severe cognitive decline. Greg drafting those aggressive and fraudulent conservatorship papers to strip me of my human rights. Thomas installing hidden surveillance cameras in my living room, hoping to catch me in a moment of engineered confusion. They truly believed they had cornered a frail, helpless old woman. They did not realize they had just invited a master forensic auditor to a game of financial chess. I remember the sheer thrill of pulling that signature page out from under Greg's massive stack of legal jargon. I remember the smooth glide of my thermal friction pen as I signed my name, knowing the ink would completely vanish the second the document sat in the heat of his luxury sedan. I remember the profound, unyielding satisfaction of logging into my banking portal before dawn and executing the revocation of proxy. The moment the federal software flashed red and initiated an automatic fraud freeze on every single one of Thomas's bank accounts was a masterpiece of digital justice. They scrambled like cornered rats. They tried to stage a family intervention in their suburban living room, dripping with condescension and fake sympathy, while Patricia proudly wore my stolen vintage sapphire necklace right to my face. They thought they were intimidating me, but they were simply providing me with a crystal-clear audio recording of their criminal confessions. And then Caleb and I uncovered the darkest secret of all, the massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme they were running through their wealthy church congregation. They had stolen the youth ministry funds and the retirement savings of innocent, faithful people. They needed my estate to quietly replace the stolen capital before the independent auditors arrived. I could have easily walked into a local police precinct and handed over the evidence, but quiet justice is rarely effective justice. The innocent church elders deserved to know exactly who was standing in their sanctuary. The predators needed to be dismantled in the bright, unforgiving light of public exposure. I will never forget the feeling of slipping into that elegant emerald green gown. I will never forget the heavy, familiar weight of the platinum and sapphire necklace resting against my collarbone as I walked into the Oak Ridge Country Club. The grand ballroom was a staggering display of stolen wealth filled with thousands of imported orchids and a towering ice sculpture. I remember the sound of Patricia's crystal champagne flute shattering against the hardwood floor the second she saw me wearing the jewelry she had locked inside her home safe. I remember Thomas desperately trying to signal the venue security guards to drag me out into the night, and the absolute pride I felt when my grandson Caleb stepped in to block them. The climax of the evening remains burned into my memory with absolute clarity. Walking up the steps of that stage and taking the microphone directly from the hands of the man who tried to ruin me. Looking out over the sea of wealthy church investors and stripping away my grandmotherly persona to reveal the ruthless federal tax investigator hiding underneath. I remember the collective gasp of the entire ballroom as I opened the black leather ledger and read their own stolen account numbers back to them. I remember Caleb hitting the master control switch in the audio-visual booth, plunging the romantic wedding slideshow into darkness and projecting their bank transfers, their fake legal documents, and their recorded criminal confessions onto massive 10-foot screens. The ensuing chaos was a symphony of ultimate accountability. The federal agents stepping out from their undercover catering uniforms with gold badges gleaming under the chandeliers, the heavy metallic click of the handcuffs locking securely around Greg and Thomas's wrists. Patricia being escorted out of the country club in her aggressively bright pink designer gown, facing immediate charges as a willing accessory to grand larceny. The lavish $150,000 wedding reception was instantly transformed into a locked-down federal crime scene. I did not just survive their attack. I orchestrated their absolute and total destruction using nothing but their own greed and a fundamental understanding of federal tax statutes. I worked tirelessly alongside my former colleagues to trace the labyrinth of offshore accounts and claw back 95% of the stolen church funds. I stood in the federal gallery and watched a judge sentence my son and his brother-in-law to 8 years in a penitentiary. I watched the greedy heirs lose their homes, their marriages, and their freedom. Society has a terrible habit of rendering older women completely invisible. They assume that gray hair and a quiet demeanor equate to a lack of intelligence and a total absence of fight. They believe we are meant to quietly fade into the background and hand over the fruits of our lifelong labor to the younger generation without asking any questions. My family fell victim to that exact same cultural arrogance. They called me a frail, confused old woman. They thought I would quietly surrender my life's work so they could drink champagne on my dime. I sent my own son to federal prison to protect my grandson and my dignity. So I have to ask you, was I too harsh for wearing my diamonds to their downfall, or did I give them exactly the wedding present they deserved? Let me know in the comments.